House Lothston and their black bat sigil ruled Harrenhal during what is arguably the darkest portion of its 300-year history. Given what Arya and others experienced there, that's really saying something. When Jaime hears of humans eating humans, he thinks of Mad Danelle Lothston. And when Brienne carries a Lothston shield given to her by Jaime, she is repeatedly greeted with grim reactions. One man even pulls a dagger on her. While other houses seem to have been corrupted or destroyed by the castle, what makes House Lothston so unique is how they became part of the bad reputation of Harrenhal rather than falling victim to it. Like so many of the other houses that ruled there, they have performed differently. Instead of trying to improve the reputation of the place, they kind of did the opposite and leaned into that evil and said, hey, let's make this work for us instead of fighting it. Consider that this is the house that held Harrenhal the longest. And they didn't die out so much as they were driven out, if not killed off, and not by ghosts or curses or suspicious fires, but by a king. In many ways, they are the embodiment of that ubiquitous Harrenhal mascot, the Bat. House Lothston's tale of child abduction and cannibalism, skin changing and blood magic, treason and double dealing with none other than House Blackfyre, madness and incestuous dealings with none other than House Targaryen are what we have for you today. As Sir Illifer said, a barefoot man looks for a boot, a chilly man a cloak, but who would cloak themselves in shame? Lord Lucas bore that bat, the Pander, and Manfred of the Black Hood, his son. Why wear such arms, I ask myself, unless your own sin is fouler still and fresher? Well, we've got the answer to that. Who said it to who? Well, Sir Illifer, reading who he said it to, we know it was Sir Illifer. And what happened next and why? The rumors and the regard the realm had for this house, and still has, for this family filled with infamous features. Well, we've got all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the first live stream of 2025. We're looking forward to another great year of content. It's going to be a lot of fun. As many of our past years have been, we've got a lot of things planned. And starting with this. We are still going to be doing most of our live streams on Sundays at this time, which is 3 Eastern. If you're catching it later, that's when you can catch it live. We'd love to have you show up live and participate in the chat and talk to us live. But otherwise, you can catch it on any place you listen to podcasts afterwards. And you can watch the video on YouTube, the edited video on Spotify. And of course, if you check us out on Patreon, rather, you can get all our episodes ad-free. Our good friend Nina contributed quite a bit to this episode. She had some really insightful takes on themes and connections and parallels and just regular insight into House Lothston. Very, very useful, as is very common for Nina's input to us, or for us. And her latest blog post over on goodqueenally.tumblr.com, that's with one L in alley, is on Ryam red wine. In fact, Nina's working on a significant amount of Ryam red wine content that will probably be made into an episode, a Ryam red wine episode, one of the most famous Kingsguard of all time, sort of the Barristan the Bold in a different era, maybe a quieter era, but no less interesting. So that's on the horizon. And if you want a little tease of the sort of things that could show up in there, well, check out goodqueenally.tumblr.com. If you have questions for us, you can email them to westeroshistory@gmail.com. That's any sort of question you have, whether it's about this episode or other episodes, or just you have a question for us. Hit us up. And of course, you can also ask questions live if you are here participating live. At the end of this episode, I'll mention some others that relate to this one, things that we mentioned that came up in the course of our discussion. And if you are willing or wanting to stay immersed, well, that's your ticket. Starting with our frequent trivia question here. What is the first hour of night in Westeros called? And all these hours have nicknames. What's that one called? I first made notes for a House Lothston episode, and it'll be, by the way, a miracle if I get through this episode not mispronouncing House Lothston. That's very hard to say. It's a tongue twister. But yeah, I started making notes for this episode back in 2013. I mean, this show has only existed, this podcast, since like 2012 era. So you can see where my interest was. I've been fascinated by them since a long time ago. And well, why didn't we make an episode about them until now? Well, I blame the curse of Harrenhal. Yeah, that's clearly who's at fault here. But honestly, that 2013, I mean, that's before the World of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood, both of which gave us more information. So it's kind of a good thing that we waited. And why the heck not? You know, better late than never, and we'll have fun with it. And even if we have things to add to it later, I do think we'll learn more about House Lothston in the long run. But we've got a lot to cover today. So we have a substantial amount, and that'll set us up for whatever happens in the future. This does have some companionship to our other Harrenhal episodes, like The Old God's Eye with Joe Magician, or Dreams of Daemon with Quinn, the GM. But this one has no TV content, this episode. We're going to speculate a little bit at the end on how the Lostons might appear on TV, because that is likely to happen. But so far, it hasn't, because the Lostons didn't exist during the time period of House of the Dragon, and they didn't really exist. Well, they kind of did, but not really. Like, very vaguely, barely, like a Hedge Knight style. So technically they did, but not in any way you would ever expect to see them. And they certainly didn't exist in Game of Thrones. But like I said, we are likely to see them, and the likely place for that is Dunk and Egg, the TV show, and the future books. So that's pretty cool. So this episode is a House lore episode, first of all, but of course, Harrenhal lore is included because the two are inextricable here. Obviously, House Lothston didn't have another seat, only Harrenhal, so this is the one place that they've really made their name. The sections of this episode are going to talk about the first mention and the earliest mention. The difference, of course, is the first mention is the first time we read it in terms of when it was penned by George. The earliest mention means the first chronological mention, as in the internal timeline. Maegor's Rewards is the next section. Then we have a Strong Revival, which, yes, does refer to House Strong. Then the Black Bat Takes Flight, the First Lord Lothston, the Young Dragon's Reign, Baelor's Reign, Viserys II and Aegon the Unworthy. We're going to cover Lothston during those times. Then there'll be I dug up a little bit of real-life information about bats just for fun. And then we have Harrenhal's Century of Blood, the First Blackfyre Rebellion, Manfred of the Black Hood, Mad Danelle, who is probably the character you all are most familiar with from House Lothston, Mad Danelle, so she'll be near the end. Then the inspiration for Mad Danelle is Elizabeth Bathory, who was a Hungarian noble. Then the Last of Lothston and the Lothston Legacy, followed by our standard outro. All right, let's get to it with that first mention. The first time the name Lothston is uttered comes in A Clash of Kings, Arya 9, in the relevant location.
Why should I wager my feet for the chance to sweat in Winterfell in place of Harrenhal? You know old Ben Blackthumb? He came here as a boy, smithed for Lady Went and her father before her, and his father before him, and even for Lord Lothston, who held Harrenhal before the Wents. Now he smiths for Lord Tywin, and you know what he says? A sword's a sword, a helm's a helm, and if you reach in the fire, you get burned, no matter who you're serving. Lucan's a fair enough master. I'll stay here.
Narrator voice. He did not, in fact, stay there. He being Gendry. Of course, Arya talks him into leaving. She sort of lies to him, but also sort of tells the truth that he wasn't willing to face. Anyway, that's not the point here, but it is a fun moment. They are both very aware of the reputation of Harrenhal and experience horrors while there, personally, and just things they see to happen to other people. And that reputation that they are aware of is mostly from House Lothston. Not only is it, as we said at the beginning, the house that held it the longest, but they held it the most recently after House Went. And House Went really didn't have a bad reputation. They had a tragic reputation, kind of like most of the houses that held the castle, instead of one that, like we said, leaned into that evil and made it part of who they are. Lothston is not a real-world name. Neither is Went, just for thoroughness here. I couldn't find it in use anywhere else. There's no like real-world person with that name that I could find. Or, like I said, or Went, W-H-E-N-T. None of those I could find anywhere else. But went, I think, I don't know what that means, but there is a potential root origin here. The word in Old English, loth, means evil or loathsome. Stun, S-T-O-N, means stone. So, well, this actually describes Harrenhal better than the House Lothston, perhaps, but it works for both, because evil stone? Yeah, loathsome stone. That works quite well. I don't know if George did that on purpose. It seems maybe too much of a coincidence to not be, but yeah, we don't know for sure.
To be clear, when you say about Wench, you mean like there's no real inspiration you think that George took for Wen, not that there isn't like a real people with the last name.
I looked at a W-H-E-N-T up and could not find anyone with that real world name.
I see 3 people right here.
Oh, do you?
Yes.
Oh, who?
Businessmen, footballers, police chiefs.
Okay.
British and American.
All right, then I must have missed on that one. Thanks for the catch. Cool. All right. Well,
it is definitely an existing surname.
It's not. I guess it's not a. It's not a reference to anything significant. Then.
Yes, that's what I thought.
It's just a real name. Okay, cool.
But...
Anyway, the first chronological mention of House Lothston comes in Fire and Blood. Quote.
Maegor stood alone. The king turned to the crowd. "Who will come and stand beside his king?" he called. Many turned away in fear or pretended that they did not hear, for the prowess of the warrior's sons was known to all. But at last one man offered himself, no knight, but a simple man-at-arms who called himself Dick Bean. "I've been a king's man since I was a boy," he said. "I mean to die a king's man." Only then, as he's laughing, I can't continue. Sorry, his laughing. Okay. Only then did the first knight step forward.
"This bean shames us all,"
he shouted.
"Are there no true knights here? No leal men?"
The speaker was Bernard Brune, the squire who had slain Harren the Red and been knighted by King Aenys himself. His scorn drove others to offer their swords. The names of the four Maegor chose are writ large in the history of Westeros. Ser Bram of Blackhull, a hedge knight, Ser Rayford Rosby, Ser Guy Lothston, called Guy the Glutton, and Ser Lucifer Massey, Lord of Stone Dance. And I could have said Guy or Guy, but I like the idea of Ser Guy.
Just a guy.
Ser Dude.
Yeah, just Ser Dude. Yeah, I assume it's Guy, but yeah, Guy. Guy is funnier. There's a lot in that quote. It's creepy and it's funny, as actually I could barely get through it because of the funniness.
I could barely get through it because you were laughing at me.
I was laughing at what I bean. I know, it's too funny. There's also like all the rhymes in there. It's like, he called. Many turned away in fear, pretended that they did not hear. For the prowess of the warrior's son was known to all. Yeah, all these rhymes. It's great. George is sneaky with his alliteration and his rhymes that you sometimes don't realize are even there. So, and it has the phrase history of Westeros in there, so of course we love that. It nods at Dunk and Egg, which is where a lot of today's story is going, because again, this is the era that the Lostons were most active in the same era that Dunk and Egg were active in, at least the second part. The trial by 7 is mentioned here. And are there true knights here? That's the same line that Duncan utters in a pretty different context, but it's a trial by 7, so there's a lot in common here. Now, in the Hedge Knight, Lionel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm, is excited for the trial of 7 because there hadn't been one in more than a century. This one was more than 160 years before Ashford Meadow, so this could be that one. It's more than 100 years. It's quite a bit more than 100, but this definitely could be the one he's referring to. We definitely don't have another candidate. So that's cool. And it's really on topic for us. The tone here for how the Lothstons are viewed in world and how George sets us readers up to think about them. Guy, or Guy the Glutton, is killed in the melee, along with everyone else except Maegor himself. But the point is, the first Lothston we ever hear of stands for Maegor, alongside a guy named Lucifer at a crucial moment when his throne is up in the air. If Maegor had lost, if guys like Guy the Glutton hadn't stood for him, then Maegor's reign might not have even happened. He'd have been dead, or he would have lost his challenge. So, and they weren't going to do it. that Bean shamed them all. Dick Bean, we all love, he's hilarious, but it's kind of his fault that Maegor's king. So, I don't know. Yeah, again, creepy and hilarious at the same time. Now, this might mean that the Lostons were originally from the Crown Lands, and it's a little confusing because later we're going to hear that the Lostons are hedge knights. But here it says the speaker, Bernard Brune, is a hedge knight, and it doesn't refer to the others that way. So what our guess is they started off as household knights to somebody, or had a little bit of acclaim or notice. Then, because of this, they got rewarded by Maegor and rose up a little higher. But then by the time Maegor's reign collapsed, Maegor's reign didn't go very well. The Lostons declined again, became hedge knights, and then in the future, earned Harrenhal. So this happened in the 40s, and the Lostons won't get Harrenhal for real until 151. So yeah, we're well ahead of that. And it's because it's a little peculiar, that just makes me lean into even more what George is doing here by associating the Lostons with Maegor and, Lucifer and just a bad cause. Like, they are very quickly notable as a villainous house. There's very little about them. It's like, oh, there's some good, some bad. Not really. Not with this house. There's some houses like Peak, and to a lesser extent, House Bracken, the Boltons. There's really very few good things you can say about them, and the Lostons, they belong in that category, it looks like. Amanda Molyneux sends a super chat, says, Happy New Year, Ashea and Aziz, and all the Westorians. Happy New Year to you as well. Yes, we're looking forward to a great 2025. We hope it's the same for you all out there. We hope you are happy and healthy, and well, if you're enjoying a podcast, then, hey, you're doing better than a lot of people. Speaking of rewards, Maegor's rewards is our next section. He was, of course, well known for brutality. I don't need to explain that to you all. But he was quite generous on the rare occasions when he was pleased by something. The Lostons would, like I said, later be gifted Harrenhal, obviously not by Maegor. He would be dead for a long time before that. But Maegor did hold a contest for ownership of Harrenhal after he turned on someone he had been quite generous to. Let's go through that briefly. His second wife was Alice Harroway. He at first lavished her with gifts and elevated her father all the way to Hand of the King, something we'll see happen a lot in the era where the Lostons are active. By that I mean a woman pleases the king and gets promoted to Hand of the King. Yeah, of course we're talking about Aegon the Unworthy. But here it happened with Maegor as well. So when she announced she was pregnant, Alice Harroway, he was even more pleased. Because he was desperate for an heir. Remember that. He never did have one. He never had a child of his own body, at least not one that survived. This one, in fact, was born, but premature and very monstrous. Right? The whole draconic baby syndrome that only Targaryens seem to have. Well, this was a case of that. Maegor became convinced, though, that this couldn't be me, even though, from our perspective, of course it's you. Of course it's a Targaryen child that this happened to. Who else would it happen to? But Maegor became convinced of the exact opposite, thanks in part to Tiana of the Tower, who appears to have come up with a whole list of names that Alice slept with in order to make sure she had a child by Maegor. She went and slept with 20 men, all whom had a kid, 20 good men, right? Who had already had kids to make sure she would have a kid that she could have become the king or queen of Westeros, the next monarch or whatever. So this was all probably made up, though. Alice was probably innocent. It doesn't matter from Maegor's perspective, though. He believed it. He was convinced. He went full Maegor, right? He executed Alice and her father via gruesome torture. Then he marched on Harrenhal, killed everyone that had a single drop of Harroway blood, then marched on Lord Harroway's town and did the same thing. Then he held that aforementioned contest, which was a melee in the streets of Lord Harroway's town where the winner gets Harrenhal. 23 men fought for it, so a little more than 20 good men, 23 good men, or 20 bad men. I don't know about this. These are people that Maegor liked. So, so not a huge number of contestants. You get a whole town and there's only 23 guys are fighting. It's like they might not see each other for like an hour at a time. These were all knights of his household. So again, yeah, guys who were like close to Maegor, who had won favor with Maegor. And how do you win favor with a guy like Maegor? Probably by doing bad things. So maybe one of these 23 knights of his household was a descendant of Guy Lothston. Maybe that was the reward for the Lostons at the time, that since Guy Lothston stood for Maegor and helped him win his crown and died doing it, well, reward that family. Even Maegor would do something like that. He wasn't, he's not one to overlook that, even as bad as he was. But maybe there was no Lothston to reward. Maybe the name just came back up later. Anyway, we don't know, but it's a valid theory in my mind. So this is perhaps the largest prize. Well, it's certainly the largest prize in terms of physical size ever for a tournament. Harrenhal, right? Perhaps it's the most valuable ever for a tournament, but that depends on how you value Harrenhal. Harrenhal has a lot of positive value and a lot of negative value. I don't know how you, adjust for all that on the accounting books, which is how do you value the curse? How do you value the chance that your heirs will die off or go insane or whatever? I don't know. How much do you factor in nightmares, But again, at this time, Harrenhal, it had a bad reputation, but it hadn't yet had the Lothstons. So the fully cursed reputation that it has now hadn't been developed. We have shown in past episodes how that reputation did come along gradually. It was just every year, Harrenhal looks a little bit worse. It wasn't just one thing, just a lot of things that just kept happening decade by decade. So Maegor helped, of course. What he did to the Harrowaves really kicked up the talk of curses related to Harrenhal, but that's going to carry forward, and the Lostons will be a big part of that, of course, perhaps earning the most credit for how it's viewed now. At the time, House Towers won the castle. They won the melee, but they didn't win all the lands. That's a big factor. Whenever you're talking about Harrenhal and who thrives there and who doesn't, it has a good bit to do with how much of the surrounding countryside are they allowed to own. When they own a lot of the surrounding countryside, they can actually afford it. They can pay for it, they can make repairs, they can have soldiers, and even though it's still very expensive to upkeep, it doesn't swallow them up with expenses. It's not like a white elephant situation where the upkeep of the place is more than they can afford, and so they just kind of sink with it. That's what happens to a lot of the houses that hold it, including this Maegor Towers, or this House Towers. Even though they named their heir Maegor Towers, he died impoverished with no children in 61 AC. Now, what a common thing to happen to a house that has Harrenhal. Dying without children. It isn't even necessarily awful things happen to them. They just didn't have children. That's what happened to the Towers. There wasn't plague or anything like that, but there was Maegor. Maegor, most of the members of House Towers were killed fighting in his wars. But still, that doesn't mean there couldn't be children, right? So a long-time theory we've had that will pop up again in this one off and on is the idea that something is wrong with Harrenhal from a fertility perspective. Something in the water or the air. And it could be supernatural. It could be both. Could be the humidity. Could be just bacteria. Who knows? Mold. I mean, there's a lot of regular explanations that would probably cover a lot of the bases here for why so many families seem to have trouble procreating at Harrenhal. There could be a mundane explanation, but yeah, it could be supernatural, could be a little of both. Now, the Maegor himself, Maegor Towers, was sickly and didn't last very long. So this house only had Harrenhal for like a decade or more, and Queen Rhaena then kind of had it next. Queen Rhaena, as in the older brother of Jaehaerys and Alysanne and all them, the one who Maegor overthrew or usurped. So she lived there about 12 years, and etc. And then we move on to House Strong. Before that, super chat from Tommy Joe Wagner. Thanks, Tommy. Appreciate that. Say hey to everyone in New York up there. And from Books Immersed from Canada. I almost said Canada. Canada sounds kind of cooler, actually. Canada sounds cool, too. I like that name. Anyway, happy Books Immersed says, Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you both. Thank you all for your hard work. Looking forward to an amazing year of Westeros content. We appreciate that. It's very motivating to hear from you all and to feel the support. We're going to keep them coming no matter what, but you know, it means a lot to feel validated from you guys. It really does. The next section is called A Strong Revival. So when Rhaena passed in 73 AC, the Strongs got it, right? The House Strong. They were a real mixed bag during their Harrenhal era. Obviously, Larys burned his own family and never had any kids of his own. Under the Strongs, however, the house did gain a lot of wealth and prominence and suffered none of the pennilessness of House Towers. This implies that they were given more of the land around Harrenhal, right? And they didn't want it to be poor in this area. House Strong was prominent. They had a hand of the king, multiple hands, and they had, or multiple small council members anyway. Yeah, no, multiple hands, yeah. And the Great Council of 101 was held there. The place where they name a new king, or the future king anyway. And almost everyone who's anyone comes there. This place isn't going to be left shabby for such an event. No, they had to fix it up. It definitely had to spend some money on this place to hold the Great Council there. You know, even if it wasn't the fanciest as it could have been. Definitely required some upgrades, you know? This is, again, so we have to keep track of the ins and outs and ups and downs of Harrenhal and make sure we're aligning these factors correctly. So after the Dance of the Dragons, skipping ahead, Harrenhal was ruled for an uncertain length of time by Alice Rivers, right, who was probably a descendant of House Strong, and who definitely claimed to be the mother of Prince Aemon's child. As of now, we don't know whatever happened to her or that kid or her dragony illusions, assuming they were illusions, but either way, we don't know what happened to her. It seems she was probably killed or driven off at some point. That's the best we can do for now. We do know that Harrenhal was empty and completely unowned after that. Something like maybe 10, 15 years of this, of being completely abandoned. During which time, well, the problems of upkeep would have gotten much worse. Without regular upkeep, you're going to see some significant damage. Maybe a thing collapses here or there, something else rots away. You got 10 to 15 years of no one upkeeping this place. I'm not so sure it was well taken care of by Alice Rivers either, or Larry Strong, because Larry Strong, as much as he kind of fits the vibe of Harrenhal as a villainous guy, he barely lived there. I mean, he did when he was younger, but like all his villainy comes at court from King's Landing. Like he didn't even go back there before his death, as far as we know. It's like he came to court and then never went back to Harrenhal, as far as we know, or maybe just a couple of times. None that were important enough to mention. And not to mention how Strong's wealth was taken by Prince Daemon at the start of the war. And the castle was devastated during it by Prince Aemon on Vagar. He got a thorough burning, not as thorough as Balerian's, but the castle probably lost the splendor and prestige that it had gained under the Strongs, or regained under the Strongs. Whatever work had been done to make it nicer for the Great Council, well, that was probably lost. So we have something like 90 years between Guy, let's call him Guy Lothston. He's both. He's Guy Lothston, and the next named Lothston. And this is part of why we assume there was a reward from Maegor, because if you're a hedge knight or a hedge knight family, like what are the odds that you're still around 90 years later? Like it's really hard to keep a landless family going, you know, like where do you raise your children? You know, how do you have your stable income to support a family? It's difficult. It's not impossible that the Lostons had some lesser holdings that we've never heard about, because it is a little strange that they go from basically nothing to Harrenhal, but less strange when you hear who was involved in that decision and why. So it's a little tricky for us to guess at, but there's a lot of possibilities here. Let's talk about the Black Bat takes flight here. This is when House Lothston gets going. So like I said, many houses were destroyed by Harrenhal, and Lostons seem to be the first to embrace the place, like use the evil reputation as a form of power in and of itself. Say, hey, I'm the Lord of Harrenhal. That's the castle with all that cursed, rough reputation. That's the power I'm bringing to the table, rather than they don't present it as something they have to deal with. They present it as something they can like use against you.
That sounds like the pitch for your like home renovation show. Embrace the place. That's the name of it, right?
Embrace the place. Yes, that is what I'm going to call it. Yes. If you can, that'll be my claim to fame. If I can turn a place like Harrenhal into a beautiful living space, then what can't I do? You know, well, of course I can't.
You almost had it completely wrong. A beautiful living space, place, embrace.
Could workshop on this a little more. It's almost there. So at first, maybe it didn't start as evil or cursed for them. That it did happen, certainly. It did come later. At first, it was just more scandalous, incestuous maybe, and some other things of that nature. Let's go through that and then work our way up to the gradually increasing supernatural elements, potentially. The first Lord Lothston. Okay, 5 years after the Dance of the Dragons, roughly the year 136, we'll say, there was a man named Sir Lucas Lothston. He was named to replace Sir Gareth Long as Red Keep Master-at-Arms. Remember, Gareth Long was sent to the Wall after that whole secret siege business, and Sir Lucas replaced him. He was, quote, a fine young swordsman. To have made the role of Master-at-Arms, to have achieved that, implies, well, skill, obviously. Fine young swordsman. It's pretty clear there. But he had to have been known already. I mean, you don't just kind of randomly appear as Master-at-Arms. They picked from a pool of available candidates, people who were kind of next up, like guys who had been around for a while. Again, this is the whole idea of them maybe being household knights or living in the Crown Lands, something relevant, something that put them on the map. I doubt anyone remembered Guy Lothston at this point, Guy at this time, because it had been, 90 years or so. Maybe Lucas Lothston fought well in the Dance of the Dragons. That's a very straightforward way to get noticed, right? He got this appointment 5 years after the war. It fits. Maybe Lothston was a neutral party. Maybe his house, being so small, didn't really take a side. Didn't have a lot of connections to the existing players like Unwin Peak or the other factions. So someone both parties could agree on. Like, hey, this guy doesn't come in and tip the scales one way or the other. He's a candidate that's kind of an unknown. He's the grandson of a hedge knight. So something that both blacks and greens could maybe agree on. I don't know. Anyway, compare him to Littlefinger. And these comparisons will continue. Lucas has a lot of Littlefinger in him. Littlefinger, obviously not nearly as good a swordsman, but that's not, of course, the be-all, end-all here. Now, a lot of people thought Littlefinger wasn't ambitious either. So maybe they thought that about this guy. Just a up-jumped hedge knight, the grandson of a hedge knight, swordsman. What possible political power can this guy wield? He doesn't seem threatening. Maybe he's not very ambitious. Littlefinger, again, didn't seem very ambitious either, and that was a huge mistake. And this guy also is going to rise a lot higher than you would expect for the grandson of a hedge knight, which Littlefinger was too. Let's not forget. Grandson of a hedge knight, Littlefinger was. Yeah. So it's easy to imagine that whatever status this family got under Maegor, they lost it because, Maegor lost the throne. So that's not good. And if they were one of the houses that stood by Maegor and then abandoned him, well, that's not good either, because Jaehaerys was wary of those who fought for Maegor. And he didn't really appreciate those who switched sides as, oh, now they're on my side. No, they're just changing sides because they're losing. And they still fought for Maegor in the first place, right? Which is, he wasn't really big on working with people that had worked for Maegor. A lot of them got sent to the Wall or just weren't given court positions. So that makes sense. But there's a lot of reasons why you can just fall from grace. One lord who manages the family badly can destroy the whole thing. So there's a lot of possibilities here. But if it was something about shutting them out because of who their allies were, well, Jaehaerys was king for a really long time, so the Lothtons would remain shut out for a really long time. But by the time Lucas was named Master-at-Arms, Maegor had been dead for over 80 years, Jaehaerys for almost 30, so the obscurity of the Lothtons might have actually worked in their favor a bit here. People might have forgotten who that history, Lucas might not have even known his ancestor fought for Maegor, probably did, but it wouldn't be common knowledge, I don't think. This appointment actually came from Hand of the King Lord Torrin Manderley, a northerner who may never have heard of the Lothtons at all. That wouldn't be surprising in the slightest. And by accounts, Sir Lucas, though he's going to turn into quite the scumbag, he was a good teacher in terms of swordsmanship, as far as we hear. He was patient, he was effective. Young Prince Viserys, who eventually will be Viserys II, saw Lucas as his favorite teacher. And even his solemn, rarely happy elder brother, the King Aegon III, actually also came to respect Sir Lucas. Apparently grudgingly, but it was real hard to get respect out of King Aegon III. That boy just was very sad. He was traumatized, and, it was hard for him to see the good in anything. 13 years later, in the year 149, Sir Lucas was still the Master-at-Arms and was thus well established. So he had been at court for more than a decade. His status had risen, his family's status had risen, though he wasn't married, and I don't know if any of his family was actually around. Certainly the name Lothston was on the rise. King Aegon III was still on the throne in 149, but by then, Prince Viserys was hand of the king, and both of them had children of their own, meaning Viserys and Aegon. Sir Lucas would have been in turn teaching those children, right? So he's still teaching Targaryens how to sword fight. Now, at this era, since Prince Viserys and Aegon were older, they're probably not getting those lessons anymore. So now we have, it's a little confusing because Viserys is the younger one, but he had kids before his older brother, the King Aegon III. And the children in question here, the eldest were Aegon, the one that's going to be Aegon the Unworthy, and Aemon, the one that's going to be Aemon the Dragon Knight. Those two are, of course, brothers, and they were only born about a year apart. They would have been 13 and 14 in the year 149. So that's the most likely the two that he spent the most time with in this era, Lucas Lothston, Aemon and Aegon the Unworthy. The connection to Aemon the Dragon Knight's not going to amount to much. Well, Aemon was a good person and wouldn't have much in common with Lucas outside of swordplay. Aegon the Unworthy and Lucas Lothston would develop quite a relationship that would carry on for decades. Aegon the Unworthy, of course, had a huge, uncountable number of mistresses, but there's 9 famous ones, right? 9 particularly notable ones who had a lot of attention, that they were the closest to him. The first one was Felina Stokeworth. Felina was born in the year 125 and came to court as a young girl early in Aegon III's reign, and she was one of the unfortunate ones injured by Unwin Peake when Unwin was trying to hurt all the little girls that he thought were a threat to his daughter marrying the king. Of course, none of that worked out for him, and he just hurt a bunch of girls for no reason, as it turned out. Some of those injuries were really severe. Thankfully for Felina, it was only a broken leg. She got pushed down some stairs. That could have been a lot worse, but maybe no lasting harm, even though maybe she had a limp or something. I don't know. But because she was one of the ones he targeted, it makes it seem like she was particularly good looking. I don't know. But that would be a factor, of course, in becoming Aegon's mistress. Now, Aegon and Felina had a relationship for about 2 years. Now, it's relevant here that Felina was a lot older than him. She wasn't old. She was 24, but he was 14. So what we're told is that she made a man of him. So what that sort of tells us is that she may be ambitious as well, and she was trying to, get this prince under her sway a bit. She might be one of the few mistresses that was more than willing, rather than some of the ones who were like, I don't know about this guy. He's creepy and gross, and yeah. Anyway, maybe Prince Viserys didn't realize what he was dealing with in terms of his son, Aegon the Unworthy, and didn't necessarily know how much Lucas, who he respected as a swords teacher, was of that ilk, or how much he was willing to do to advance his ambitions. So what happened when they got caught by the Kingsguard was Viserys said, okay, let's remove her from the picture. I'm not going to send my son away, although he did do that later. But this was after becoming exasperated with scenarios like this, where sending the girl away didn't do any good because he just found another one. Yeah, it did not work. Just like Gendry not staying at Harrenhal, sending away Felina didn't even keep Felina away from him. It didn't work in any way. So what they did here was Viserys arranged for Felina to marry Lucas Lothston. So perhaps as a reward for him, because he had been such a good teacher for so long, and a Stokeworth. That's a very big marriage for a hedge knight family, a guy who's just a master at arms, and his family is not particularly distinguished. But she was, of course, considered dishonored by Westerosi society by sleeping with the prince, and, she's not a virgin anymore. Oh, no. But, of course, Westerosi care about that. Now, so the idea was give him Harrenhal and marry her to him. So he went from Sir to Lord of Harrenhal, and we're told that Prince Viserys persuaded King Aegon to do this. And because they both had respect for Sir Lucas, that this was easier to get through. Aegon was relatively willing because he already had respect for Sir Lucas. Mistake, but you can see why they did it perhaps at the time. And for Felina, this is your punishment? You get married to the largest castle, and you're becoming the head of a new family that owns the largest castle in Westeros. That's your punishment? Well, it is Harrenhal, so yeah, maybe it is that bad. We'll see. What happens next? Let's go through it. And, yeah, maybe Nina argues that maybe Lothston's status was so on the rise at this point that it wasn't such a big gap as I'm making it out to be. Either way, it was a scandal. So one way or another, there was some embarrassment and some sweeping things under the rug and getting it out of court. So almost exactly 20 years after the dance, Harrenhal was finally given to someone again. House Lothston became the 6th noble house to rule Harrenhal. And it looks like they received the rich version rather than the poor. We've been through that a few times, right? It depends on how much of the surrounding land countryside they got. I guess because of Lucas's popularity, his regard by the prince and the king and some of these other people at court perhaps also liked him. He was given a pretty generous gift here. Of course, he's not the one who did something wrong here, not yet. It was Felina cheating with Aegon or whatever. Not cheating. Neither of them were married at the time. But you know what I mean. They're the ones who got the punishment. But let's remember, Harrenhal, not that far from King's Landing. 2 weeks ride, we're told, roughly. And Aegon just kept going there. He would just show up. He would travel to Harrenhal, sleep with Felina. It just... Maybe Viserys should have sent Felina somewhere farther away. In a way, this might have made things worse, because Aegon could continue to sleep with Felina, but get away with it, because it would be out of sight. So maybe keeping things out of sight was all they cared about. But clearly it was still known. It's here in the history books. We know about it, right? So, yeah. As we said earlier, the castle was probably in really bad shape given the war and it being left unattended for as long as 15, maybe even 20 years. Well, probably not 20, but maybe 15 years. So even though we suspect the Lostons had a large income, they would have had to spend a lot of it on repairs. And there would be a lot of bats. While the humans didn't live there, the bats would be moving in. Of course, the bats were living there and still do, even while the humans live there, but the bats would be completely unfettered in their home space there. And this is probably when the bat sigil was taken by House Lothston, because, I mean, otherwise that's a pretty big coincidence, right? They just already had a bat sigil and like, hey, that's why we're giving you Harrenhal. You are
manifesting it, you know?
Yeah, or if we go to his son, they're Manfred festing it. So that would be a huge coincidence if they are, unless they manifested it. Yeah, like that. So, yeah, and there's lots of, Nina reminds us, there's lots of times where someone changed their sigil because of a big change in fortune. The Tollans changed their sigil during the conquest from a ghost to a dragon. The Harroways, Coherises, and Towers all made sigils inspired by Harrenhal specifically, right? So, yeah, it's not only common-ish, but it's happened several times at Harrenhal specifically. So that was probably keeping them occupied for a little while, repairing their new castle, establishing themselves, trying to perhaps not be looked down on as an up-jump lord. You know, that happens a lot in Westerosi society. You know, you make someone becomes a lord and they get this big castle and it's bigger than the castles of people who have been in noble families for thousands of years. And they're like, well, why do they deserve that bigger castle than us? Well, hopefully that castle just swallows them whole. You know, the pettiness and jealousy of noble houses was probably part of this. And anyway, 6 years into their lordship of Harrenhal, King Aegon III died. And the young dragon, his eldest son, ascended to the throne. Now, I'm guessing Lucas sent men to the campaign. Even though he only had Harrenhal for a little while, he would be expected to contribute. And since he probably didn't have his own heir yet, or if he did, he definitely didn't have an adult heir, I don't think, at this point. It seems very unlikely given the timeline, unless he had a son with somebody before Felina, which that kid probably would be a bastard. I don't know. So it's very unlikely that he had an adult heir. Probably didn't have an heir at all at this point. But regardless, that would explain why Lucas probably didn't go on campaign himself. As somebody skilled with the sword, you might think, well, this is a candidate to go fight in the wars in Dorne. But Usually noble houses with one member don't risk themselves like that, so I'm guessing he didn't go, but contributed with funds and soldiers, perhaps. Not much to say there. Baelor's reign. This was a longer term reign. It was 10 years instead of 4-ish. And, of course, this happened right after his brother, Daeron, the young dragon, was killed in Dorne. Now, we know the kind of man Baelor was, basically. I don't suppose he would have been pleased with Harrenhal in general. Just the dark reputation of the place, the Old Gods Association, Harren, just everything. Talk of curses. Like, this is just not Baelor's bag, obviously. Nor is any sort of sex scandal. He's down on any of that stuff, too. So the Aegon Felina stuff, he wouldn't have been happy with that either. He might have thought, this castle needs a lot more prayer. But I don't know that he had a lot to say about it, though. Certainly Baelor had bigger things to be distracted by. We don't hear about him dealing with Harrenhal or having any comments about it. It's just kind of one of those things where you can make some assumptions based on what kind of man he was and what kind of castle that was. He might have thought it a good thing that Felina was going to marry Lucas, and maybe this marriage would redeem them a bit. It's an honorable marriage done under the sight of gods and men, and under the auspices of the faith. So Baelor might look kindly on that. And well, in 164, Felina gave birth to a daughter whom they called Jane, and Baelor would look kindly on that. They actually had a kid. This is rare to have. When we've talked about, it's hard to have kids at Harrenhal, but it's not like it never happens. So the problem is, though, we just said a minute ago, who kept visiting Harrenhal all this time? King Aegon. Well, he's not King Aegon yet, but Prince Aegon, who will later be Aegon the Unworthy, he continues to visit there all this time. There's no evidence that he stopped those visits, and there's no evidence that he was prevented from doing that until he was sent to Braavos, which wasn't in 164. So the point is that Jane Lothston might have been fathered by Prince Aegon the Unworthy. Still, again, not called the Unworthy yet, but you get it. And because of that, we have almost the same level of suspicion for all their descendants. If Jane was fathered by Aegon, or any of the other children that Felina had, then those might have been fathered actually by Aegon, except any that came after Aegon IV's death, of course. But we don't even know when those children were born. So right now, it's a big question mark that points very heavily towards this possibility. Lots of gray area. Jane's the only one for sure we knew the suspicion fell on, but it seems likely to have fallen on any other kids of her that were born around this time. Now, I've always speculated that Baelor wasn't a big fan of tournaments, but I'm not so sure I'd go so far as to say he shut them down altogether. It's possible, but maybe I'm guessing more he just frowned on them. This is a good excuse for someone like Lord Lucas to say, hey, I organized a tournament, and that's a reason for Aegon to come to Harrenhal and sleep with Felina again. Just kind of like how much later the Wentz had a tourney at Harrenhal as an excuse to gather some lords together to maybe talk about what to do about Aerys. A much bigger scale ambition there at the tournament at Harrenhal vis-a-vis Aerys and Rhaegar. But still a similar sort of thing where you hold a tournament, and that's an excuse to bring a lot of powerful people together and do stuff under that umbrella, under that disguise. At some point, Lucas became known as Lucas the Pander. If you don't know what pander means, it's basically pimp. A man who offers his wife to a prince for favor? Yeah, fair game calling him the pander. Even if she was willing, which it appears she was, that doesn't change it. You're still the pander. you still call him that. So, yeah. Now, late in Baelor's reign, or not long after, another kind of uncertainty on the dates here, but Lord Lucas seems to have had a bastard son. We don't know his name. We just know there was a guy called the Bastard of Harrenhal, and he was mentioned around the time 193 as being beaten in a tournament by Sir Arlen of Pennytree. I said Penny 3. There's a lot more than 3 pennies on Pennytree. Anyway, yet again, we see the Lothston sort of wrapped into the Dunk and Egg story or era or whatever. Just even Sir Arlen has a connection here. Now, technically, this bastard of Harrenhal could have been born as far back as the 150s, but since he's a bastard, Lucas's bastard, he's not Aegon IV's son. That's the one thing we can say for sure. He's not a Targaryen bastard. But we don't, of course, we don't know who the mother is, which I guess there's a tiny chance that's a Targaryen, but really not a chance that we need to really consider much. Next up is the reigns of Viserys II and Aegon the Unworthy. Now, Viserys II reigned for just over a year. So there's no specific things we need to talk about that might have happened during, for the Lostons during that era. We'll just consider it all wrapped up into this Aegon the Unworthy reign. Now, Felina, again, probably still seeing Aegon all this time. Maybe off and on, maybe less frequently. You know, she was getting older and he had a lot of other mistresses, etc. Who knows? But I'm guessing she was no longer called Felina Stokeworth by this point. She's probably called Felina Lothston by this time. Just small point, anyway. And given this relationship, what was Lucas getting out of this? He keeps having his wife sleep with the prince. Is he getting a return on this? I mean, we called him a pimp. Pimps get paid for these arrangements, right? We guess that he got some of these favors that we discussed earlier. Maybe he didn't have those expanded lands. Maybe Harrenhal didn't have all that surrounding territory, feeding it income to help pay for its ruinous upkeep. If that hadn't been arranged yet, this would be a good candidate for the type of return favor Lucas would get. Or even greater expansion of their land. Just whatever favors you can imagine, little titles, new grants of land, they're the most likely thing. And of course, this is Aegon IV we're talking about. This is, even though he's not king yet, this is exactly his modus operandi. He would give lands, gifts, dragon eggs, hand of the king titles to people who brought him women. And well, this was the first guy to bring him a woman that we know of. So yeah, he gets some points from Aegon for being the original, you know, like a little bit of, as much as Aegon could have fondness and loyalty to somebody for things, you know, it's hard to do that when you're a raging sociopathic narcissist, but you know, still he had that inner lane, that first track. It counts for something. In the year 178, so Aegon has been king for 7 years. He's treated his wife horribly. He's had lots of mistresses. He's already had the boy who will be called Daemon Blackfyre, but isn't called that yet. The boy who is Bittersteel, who also isn't called Bittersteel by the time he's, 7 years old. Bloodraven's been born. Aemon the Dragon Knight is not yet dead, but about to be dead. He dies around this time. So the Lostons come back around again. They're trying to do a Butterwell or a Bracken, but with better luck. And what I mean by that is, what did Lord Butterwell do? He tried to get close to Aegon IV by offering his daughters for the night while Aegon was visiting Castle White Walls. What did he get in exchange for giving Aegon his daughters for the night? A dragon egg. If you recall, that dragon egg was the prize for the Mystery Night tournament. Now for the Brackens, Barbara Bracken was the 5th mistress of Aegon, and her sister Bethany was the 7th. And their father, Lord Bracken, had been hanged. Now, Bethany, if you recall, was caught abed with Sir Terence Toyne of the Kingsguard by Aegon himself. Now, we theorize that this might have been arranged. Maybe someone got them caught on purpose. Who knows? Lucas would be a candidate for one of the people that might have arranged for this discovery to happen, because that's who swoops in next. Bethany is executed horribly. Lord Bracken is executed horribly. And who comes in? Lucas, with Felina again, but with their daughter, Jane Lothston. The aforementioned. She's now 14 years old. Quickly becomes the 8th mistress of Aegon. So, yeah, particularly young, but arguably even worse. Well, definitely even worse. If it's true, this might have been his own daughter, as we said earlier. So not only was this man selling his wife to the king for favors, and before he was even king, he was doing that. He's selling his daughter, who might be that guy's daughter too. Or instead of his, it might not be his daughter. It might be Aegon's daughter. Either way, it's like, really bad, right? Like, this is terrible. And yeah, Nina suggests some similar things here, that his familiarity with Aegon in the aftermath of Terrence Bethany was like, well, hey, I'm someone you can trust. You've dealt with me before. You know me, I'm a known commodity. You can have my daughter and, you won't feel betrayed by that, etc. So, he found his in route again, and it worked better than it ever had before. For the reward for Jane and maybe bringing Felina around again, as Lucas was made Hand of the King. Again, Aegon the Unworthy named someone Hand of the King for good service in bringing him women, right? This is a real comparison to Littlefinger. We have Littlefinger selling Jane Poole into sex. Even her name is Jane, even in both cases. To the Boltons, he has her in his own brothels and then sells her to the Boltons as a fake Arya. And he's currently selling his daughter, the same woman there's Littlefinger selling Sansa, quote, Elaine to Harry Harding. Yes, not actually his daughter, but everybody thinks she is. And the vibes are very much there, these similarities. So you got Lucas doing similar things with selling his wife and daughter's honor, or sexual freedom, or whatever you want to call it, for gain, for mostly for himself. Now, to make it more scandalous, as if it could be, there was a rumor worthy of Mushroom, except actually more believable than a lot of Mushroom's salacious tales. A lot of what Mushroom says is believable, but some of the things he says about sexual escapades are less so. In this case, though, we're told that Aegon took both Felina and Jane Lothston into his bed at the same time, mother and daughter, possibly his daughter. Yuck. To be clear, all 4 of Aegon the Unworthy's hands got the job of hand after bringing him 1 or more women. Yeah, Lucas being included. So Lucas may have noticed this pattern. He, of course, noticed Aegon's proclivities early on, and those just escalated. It's like, boy, the more you bring Aegon a woman, the more he'll do for you. But this didn't work out as it could have. Certainly if Lucas hadn't acquired the name Pander yet, well, it certainly would have happened by this time. Now, again, the Brackens, you see why this is like the Brackens, because the Lord Bracken also had 2 daughters that were mistresses of Aegon IV, while 2 different Lothstons, mother and daughter, were also mistresses. That's 4 of the 9 mistresses right there covered by Bracken and Lothston. So it's interesting to consider all the interplay with the Blackfyre rebellions, which we're moving towards very soon here in this episode, because obviously the Brackens were huge in the Blackfyre rebellions as well, and Bloodraven was too, and that's the Blackwood-Bracken dynamic, which is mixed up here in play with Aegon the Unworthy's mistresses as well, because yes, Bracken mistress was number 5, Blackwood number 6, Bracken number 7, Lothston number 8. The big difference here is the Lothstons don't have a great bastard from these unions. They might have Jane Lothston, not a great bastard, but a very relevant one. But there wasn't some big male warrior figure leading troops or being noticed like Shiera Seastar. Instead, they got Harrenhal, right? So, Nina wonders as well whether George was thinking of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn here, who there's a rumor that Anne Boleyn's mother, Elizabeth Howard, was a mistress to Henry himself, and that maybe even Henry VIII was the father of Anne Boleyn too, which this is not accurate. It didn't happen, and whether George knows that or not is kind of immaterial. He might not, but George would often choose the more salacious sounding story because it's more fun. It doesn't mean he thinks it's accurate, but he might be under the mistaken impression that really happened. But either way, he chose to use it for a story. What actually happened was, immediately after the Terrence, Toyne, Bethany Bracken incident where he caught them abed, he didn't immediately start sleeping with Jane and Felina again. That apparently happened soon after, but not immediately, because he got pox from a sex worker in between this. And then he passed it on to Jane. Yeah, another piece of great luck for young Jane Lothston here. What a lucky young woman she is. So she got banished from court because he gave her pox. Yeah, that's fair. And because Aegon is, well, the unworthy, he banished Lord Lucas and Felina as well, just because he gave their daughter pox. Yeah, at least they didn't have their heads cut off like Lord Bracken, because at least there wasn't any cheating going on here. So immediately the fourth hand comes in. That's Jon Hightower. Jon Hightower got that position by bringing Aegon Shiera Seastar, and Aegon dies 6 years later. So the Lothston story continues after this. Like the Brackens, they're going to get very involved in the Blackfyre rebellions, and there's going to be a lot more plot lines, a lot more to come. In fact, I'd say the second half of the story has a lot more detail, a lot more supernatural, a lot more familiar elements. This is when we'll get into Jaime and Brienne, and some other elements that you know better than the old school history stuff. We've all heard the term mental health a million times. It means different things to different people. I want to talk about something called mental wealth, which is, it's a made-up concept like everything is really, but it's relevant, I think, in thinking about how we deal with things. I had a therapist once tell me, this is my personal experience, that the things that happen to us when we're young, whether it's trauma or just things that we struggle with, because not everything needs to be called trauma. I think that word is thrown around a little too often these days, but legitimate trauma, not saying that isn't a real thing, of course. You can describe a lot of the things you collect during your life that burden you. We'll call them that, burdens, as a beach ball that you're trying to hold underwater. It's struggling to get out. It's trying to fly out. It's going to jump into the air if it does escape. Think of those as your problems. If your problems escape, they fly out. But if that beach ball is deflated, it won't fly out. It'll just rise, come out, And that's the metaphor that she tried to impart to me for why it's important to address your own mental health and take care of yourself. And the concept of mental wealth is building up a backlog, an extra, like a cushion, so that when bad things happen in your life, you can rebound more quickly because you've got a little bit extra. You've got a little bit of cushion to burden you, or to bolster you against negative things that may come along. And of course, negative things they happen to everybody, right? We like Magic Mind as part of this process. It's not the whole process. It's not a cure-all, but it helps. Having established routines with doing things well for your body and mind is absolutely going to pay dividends in the long run. It is not a quick fix. It is not a short-term benefit. It is a long-term benefit. It is a commitment. But that is where you get a lot of the best things, by being committed to something, sticking with it. Magic Mind has a new tool, a new drink, a sleep elixir. So it's sort of like they got you in the morning for the regular Magic Mind, and they got you at night for sleep elixir. This sleep elixir, I'm going to report my personal experience with it, but I haven't gotten it yet. It's on the way to us right now. But we have looked up the ingredients, and we have looked into it a bit. Ashwagandha, kava, organic chamomile, GABA, 5-HTP, valerian, lemon balm, lavender, MCT oil, no melatonin. So we will report our personal experience with it when we've had a chance to actually use it. I'm looking forward to it because I do have sleep issues. I don't have trouble falling asleep. I have trouble staying asleep, so I'm hoping this helps with that. I'll let you know. For now, you can get 45% off the Magic Mind bundle, meaning both products, 45% off both. That's a lot of savings. If you go to magicmind.com and use the code VIPHOWJAN, VIPHOWJAN. That's right. VIP, History of Westeros, January. 45% off both the regular performance mental health shot and the mental wealth building sleep elixir. We'll tell you more when we've had more of a chance to experiment with it ourselves and report back on that, but we're very excited for that. Once again, magicmind.com, VIP, HowJan, 45% off. Sit-ins for Sithies says, a bat reputation. Yeah, instead of a bad reputation, a bat reputation. There we go. Very good. Dolorous Lady Dane says, I don't give a damn about my bat reputation. I don't give a damn about my bat reputation. Nice. And indeed, they don't really seem to give a damn about that. Or they lean into it even more. It's like, I love my bat reputation. Yeah. Amanda Molyneux says, Ghee Guy is the guy I get my butter from. Oh, that's a good pun. As in Ghee. Ghee, we were calling Guy Lothston, or Ghee Guy. Yeah, he is the butter guy. The Butterman. And we even mention a butter well in this one. Well, this is the real butter well here. As usual, I can't help myself. I had to look up some bat facts. 20% of mammals on this planet are bats. They are the second most common species of mammals. next to rats. So rats and bats. It's like, what? Why just the most common things are called rats, bats? Are cats actually next? I don't think so, but that would be funny. They're the only mammal that can sustain flight. There's other mammals that can like glide, but sustain flight, like staying and flapping, and there's squirrels that can glide and a few other things, but the bats are the only mammal that can sustain fly. They haven't evolved a ton in the past 50-ish million years, which is kind of wild to think about. There's some bats that are just not that different from 50 million years ago. But there are some major changes even despite that. You would expect more than this, but the major changes they have had are significant, like echolocation. The earliest bats didn't have the whole like radar bouncing technology that some of them have now, and they fly better than they used to. Early bats would like go from tree to tree. They were more of gliders. Now modern bats have evolved for full-blown flying. There's two different types of bats. Mostly they're categorized as microbats and megabats, but like a lot of categorizations, these things don't cover all bases. Some microbats are larger than some megabats. One of the major differences, though, the microbats use the echolocation. And the megabats actually have pretty good eyesight. Both types eat lots of insects, including those that carry diseases like mosquitoes. So that's good, but they can carry diseases themselves. So that's not good. Some places they're considered a food source. Other places they're a food pest because they eat lots of fruit. And that's not good if you're like, you depend on orchards for your living or something like that. Other places they're so interesting looking and in such great numbers that people go there as a tourist attraction. So bats can be a tourist attraction. They're a great example of something that cultural views vary quite a lot. In the West, they have a pretty negative connotation, actually very negative, like witchcraft, vampires, right? Death. So this is what George has leaned into, because this, most of Westeros is, well, it's pretty Western in terms of its physical location, but also in terms of most of the influence is Western, right? In terms of how George designed the continent and the culture. But a lot of societies in the world look at bats as a symbol of rebirth or long life. Many cultures look at them as a sign of disease. Many cultures look at them as a sign of anti-disease. And as we just explained, well, sometimes they are one or the other. So that's actually rooted in reality. If we turn our attention to bats in Westeros and Essos and such, the ones that George has actually created, well, there's a few references here. The hour of the bat is the first hour of night. It's right after sunset. Harpies of Greek and Roman myth tend to have bird wings, usually vulture or some other bird. But for George, his harpies have bat or dragon wings. So that's kind of cool, as depicted in Slaver's Bay. There's a real creepy Pentashi deity that looks like a naked pregnant woman. You're like, wait, why is that creepy? She has a bat's head. Okay, now you get it, right? That's creepy, yeah. Naked pregnant woman with a bat's head. Yeah. Okay. There's also gigantic bats living in the caves of the Green Seers, Bran Seas, which might be a different form of bat than you'd find on Earth, because on Earth, bats live everywhere except the really cold places. Maybe that's why they're in the caves, because it got cold, so they went inside. There's also killer vampire bats in Sithorios. Real vampire bats are very misunderstood. Yeah, they drink blood, but tiny amounts. One really funny fact about vampire bats is when they try to take blood from like a cow or an animal with fur, they actually shave a tiny spot first. They do like a little mini scalpel and shave a little hair so they can get their fangs in there without that little, air getting in their mouth or whatever. They're very fastidious blood drinkers. The whole culture of blood drinking animals is really neat. Like vampire bats will share blood with each other. Like they'll cough up blood to share with each other because they don't store energy very well. Blood, it's not fat. You can't store that very well. So like they have to eat constantly. So they're at risk of starvation. Anyway, let's get back to Harrenhal and the Lothtons. No more bat talk for now. This section is called Harrenhal's Century of Blood. Like I said before the break, we had a lot more detail here and a lot more blood. Lucas had a very bad reputation, but I'm not sure he was like a murderer or overly violent. Maybe he was, but that's not what he was known for. We don't know how he treated his subjects. I don't suspect he treated them well, but you never know. We definitely know some things about his descendants, though, that are bad. We also don't know when he died, Lucas, that is. But we're going to guess he outlived Aegon IV. Aegon IV didn't die very old, and he obviously had huge health problems, and Lucas was a warrior, a swordsman, so he who, as far as we know, didn't die in battle or anything, so he might have lived a longer life. So we're guessing he lived into early Daeron's reign, Daeron II's, but maybe he lived until the mid-190s. We don't know. We only know for certain that he was dead by the time of the first Blackfyre Rebellion in 196, because we know Manfred of the Black Hood had taken over by then. We also don't know what happened to Jane. Poor Jane Lothston, but given the pox and how her parents ruined her reputation for gain, well, she likely had to marry down. Maybe she had to marry a household knight. It would be interesting if this Jane Lothston was the origin of House Went. House Went is going to take the castle after the Lostons. If you look at the Lothston sigil, it's silver and gold background with a bat. The silver and gold could maybe refer to, the House Targaryen giving them their play here. House Went's sigil is 9 bats on gold. So it does have the vibe of a cadet branch. The same sigil with more of them and one of the same 2 colors. So, yeah. We don't know how House Went came about. We do know they were household knights of the Lothstons, who got the castle when they turned on the Lothstons at the crucial time later. So that's a good theory, I think, and I don't have another theory other than that House Went just originated somewhere in the Riverlands and got their job, and yeah, that's what happened. We also don't know what happened with Felina. Maybe she outlived Lucas. Maybe she helped Manfred rule, but there's also a small chance she died before Lucas. Maybe he even remarried. Regardless, it was their son Manfred who ascended to the lordship. There's a character referred to as Manfred with a Y instead of an E. We are 100% assuming this is the same person. The timeline kind of connects them, and it would be pretty weird for these 2 people to exist at the same time, given their name. You probably can't tell the difference if it's spoken aloud. So, yeah. And again, this is around the era where we hear of that bastard of Harrenhal losing to Sir Arlen of Pennytree. But let's go to the actual first Blackfyre Rebellion. Rather, the memory of it from our good old friend, Sir Eustace. Quote,
Sir Eustace cradled his wine cup in both hands. If Daemon had ridden over Gwaine Corbray, if Fireball had not been slain on the eve of battle, if Hightower and Tarbeck and Oakhart and Butterwell had lent us their full strength instead of trying to keep 1 foot in each camp, if Manfred Lothston had proved true instead of treacherous, if storms had not delayed Lord Bracken's sailing with the Murish crossbowmen, if Quickfinger had not been caught with the stolen dragon's eggs. So many ifs, sir. Had any one come out differently, it could all have turned to other way.
It's hard to be sure of whether this means Manfred turned on Daemon Blackfyre or simply promised his support and didn't show up. I lean towards the former, though, because I suspect a lot of houses didn't show up, but I doubt that many, if any others, fully switched sides during, and he names Manfred Lothston specifically, rather than saying if any number of these lords didn't show up or did show up instead of not showing up. This sounds a little more like a heavier indictment than simply not showing up. So I think that this was a full change of sides here. Nina suggests, yeah, it could be a little of column A, a little column B. Manfred could have made promises to support Daemon, but decided to change sides, realized his fortunes would be better to stay loyal. And or maybe someone induced him. He was given a reason by the king or by someone on the small council, something that induced him back or threatened him. Probably more likely a benefit than a threat, though, that would have moved him. Nina also wonders if there was any bad blood later between Bittersteel and Manfred, given the treatment of the Bracken women and Jane. And then what would happen with the Lostons afterwards? Like, maybe from Bittersteel's perspective, it might look like the theory we floated was more salient. Like, he might be confident that's what happened, meaning that the Lostons got Bethany caught, and that's by the king, and were able to swoop in and bring Aegon the next mistress because they eliminated Bethany from the picture so they could take the mistress spot from Aegon and become Hand of the King themselves. So from a distance, Bittersteel might see it that way. He wouldn't have been at court for any of that. He would have been fled over the narrow sea, and he would have just heard from his spies and gotten piecemeal information. But we think this theory is valid even without Bittersteel's angle, so we could definitely see why he would believe it. And it could even be true. It might even be real. Like, he might believe it because it really happened. Either way, he wouldn't be happy about what happened on the Redgrass field. He definitely wouldn't trust Manfred over not showing up at the Redgrass field, if not showing up on the other side. So there's multiple reasons why Bittersteel might dislike or distrust Manfred. Either way, though, we got to wonder, why did he initially join Daemon? Why did he side with the Blackfyres, right? The Lostons owed their support to the status quo. They got their appointment not that long before from the royal house, not from the Blackfyre. So you would think that they were still sort of owing the crown a bit for what happened, which maybe is why they didn't go through with it. Remember, Daemon's supporters were mostly second-tier houses and second sons, right? Now, the difference here, the reason you might see them wanting to fight for Daemon is because if Daemon wins, a lot of the old traditions are thrown out the window. Sure, some of them are what he's specifically trying to defend. Daemon was a traditionalist in many ways, but in his new court, if he has a new small council, it's not going to have any reds on it. It's all going to be people that supported him. And most of his supporters are new blood, or at least second tier. So that's the lost angle potentially here, is that, hey, if they are on the winning side of the rebels, there's a better chance for a high position afterwards than amongst the old guard. It's harder to get a reward when all the big players, Baratheon and Lannister and Stark, or maybe the Starks might not have been involved, but you see what I'm saying? All these big names were fighting for the loyalists. How are the Lostons going to stand out amongst all that and deserve some big reward? The bigger rewards were on Daemon's side, but so were the bigger risks. And that might have been what the risk-reward calculation might have changed. If someone comes to the Lostons and say, hey, look, if you change sides to us or just stay out of it, we'll give you this. All of a sudden, they don't have as much incentive to try to win something from Daemon. They're like, well, we've gotten 50% of that value for just sitting here doing nothing. Why risk everything for a little more? So this is just a theory, of course, but that's all we have to work with. We know Daemon was turned on by Manfred. We just don't know the circumstances and much else besides that. It's still a very compelling mystery and one I'd love to know more about. So yeah, you could see why they might have angled for a bigger reward, as there's an ambitious element to this. And you can see how that would make things more difficult in the future for Lothston Blackfyre relations. But as we'll see later, Lothston and Blackfyre sort of kind of made up later. Let's get to that. We got to move forward a little more before we get to that, though. If we consider still in the first Blackfyre Rebellion what a big deal this would have been. Again, I have to keep pointing this out. Harrenhal is not far from King's Landing. 2 weeks ride or so. That's huge given the proximity to the royal seat. If Daemon has Harrenhal, that's enormous. He's striking distance from the capital. That's a massive military problem for the Reds, right? He has this giant castle. He can put all sorts of troops there. They don't know when he's going to emanate forth. It allows him to have a place to retreat and recover. It's really bad for the Reds if the Black Dragon gets Harrenhal. What happened in the Conquest? It's the first thing Aegon the Conqueror did. He destroyed Harrenhal. What happened in the Dance of the Dragons? It's the first castle Prince Daemon, whom Daemon Blackfyre is named for, took at the beginning. And of course, during the Dance of the Dragons, Harrenhal changed times multiple times, right? It changed hands multiple times. Ditto the War of Five Kings. What does Tywin do almost right away? And the War of Five Kings breaks out. He takes Harrenhal, right? Almost immediately. It's so common as a first target. So the Lostons may have made use of that. Like, hey, we're all of a sudden we're in the center of the action here. We are in a crucial place. Let's play our hand well. We can be rewarded by it. Now, yeah. So there's a lot of things here. Now, as far as this Bastard of Harrenhal character, I keep bringing him up even though we know very little about him. Good chance he fought in this war. He fought in a tournament in 193, and the war was only 3 years later. But if the Lostons stayed out of the war, then he probably lived on. If he fought in it, decent chance he died. Again, let's talk specifically about Manfred of the Black Hood a little more than some of these decisions that happened. We don't know if he was rewarded for switching sides, but when you switch sides, yes, you can benefit from it, but going forward, it tends to look bad because no one will trust you from that point on. At least they won't trust you fully. They have to really think, okay, unless he's really bought in, unless we know for sure he has incentive to fight with us, we can't trust him. Now, Lucas himself wasn't born in Harrenhal, and there's no reason to think he had Targaryen blood. But we talked about how Felina kept sleeping with Aegon the Unworthy, so this Manfred of the Black Hood might have been Targaryen. He might have been of bat and dragon. This opens up some fun supernatural rabbit holes regarding dreams and such. He might have inherited some supernatural elements in his bloodline. We don't know the full story of the interplay of Targaryen blood, Harrenhal, the curse, the proximity of the God's Eye, Alice, Aemond, their child. There's a lot of things that are rolled up into this mystery. This is part of it, though. There's undoubtedly Manfred of the Black Hood belongs in this pastiche of Harrenhal bloodline mysteries because he might be part Targaryen. And even if he isn't, frankly, all the lords of Harrenhal are interesting in some way or another. This guy also has some creepy nickname, and we have no idea what that means either. More on that in a minute, but again, being close to King's Landing, Manfred of the Black Hood, was he at court much? We know Lucas was a bit because he started there. He was the Master at Arms, so he would have been well known at court. So Manfred of the Black Hood could have been a recluse who stayed in his towers, and his reputation grew accordingly as a mysterious, dark figure that no one saw very often. Or maybe he was someone that came to court and made pitches and asked for stuff. And these are all fun things to imagine. If he was alive when his parents did what they did with Jane, was he a party to that, meaning a witness to that? He would have been too young to weigh in. But you see your parents treat your sister like that to sell her to the king or to the prince. What does that do to your worldview, in addition to growing up in a place like Harrenhal? I can kind of see why Manfred of the Black Hood was a bad dude. He didn't have the most uplifting, ethical upbringing, right? This is a guy brought up in a cursed, dark place with a father who was a real scumbag. And it might have thrown off his worldview because Lucas was scummy, but a lot of people looked on him as positively. So it would have this guy is thought of as good, so this is good. Maybe he thinks he was brought up to think of some things that are blatantly evil is actually good. A very different worldview when you live and exist and grow at Harrenhal, right? How much other bad blood would there have been between him? We talked about Bittersteel, but there's lots of other Blackfyre supporters that would have been around that would have looked negatively on a house that started off supporting them and then switched sides. That's worse than just starting off on the other side. They're, you traitor. Everyone hates the Turncloak, no matter what side they turn to, right? That's a Westerosi thing. Yeah, it exists in other places too, but you all know that it's a big deal in Westeros. Was there ever a marriage on the table? I wonder. Well, maybe Daemon offered one of his daughters to Manfred Lothston, and then that offer got pulled, and that's why Manfred switched. Or maybe someone else offered him a marriage. We don't know who Manfred married. We don't know who his wife was. Maybe it was maybe the Reds offered him somebody, not a Targaryen probably, or almost certainly not, but maybe a bride of status, a powerful marriage that he said, okay, this is a sufficient reward for me. I'll back out of my Blackfyre support and take this woman to be my wife, or maybe someone for his son, maybe a promised bride or husband for Manfred's descendants. And speaking of, did he have any? Probably, but maybe not. Again, Harrenhal, it's tricky. The sterility issue, the descendants issues there. Harrenhal is cursed in that sense, whether supernaturally or otherwise. Jane was his sister, but was there any other brothers or sisters, and what children did any of them have? That we just have no idea. So yeah, what does the Black Hood mean? What does Manfred of the Black Hood mean? Did he sneak around? Was he like a voyeur? Was he the man behind a lot of dark deeds, like a puller of strings, evil strings? The man behind the mask, that kind of thing? It does seem like an obscuring device, like the hood keeps you from knowing things about him, like he was a secretive guy. The most mundane idea I can come up with is that he had birthmarks or malformity that he kept hidden, which you could maybe blame on Harrenhal or the Targaryen bloodlines even. Maybe a little of column A, a little column B, Nina says. Always we should consider that it's a little of both. That's almost always a valid option. So maybe he disguised himself. Maybe he had disfigurements. Maybe the Black Hood is just his kind of calling card of, well, that's a black hooded thing to do. If you see a black hooded rider coming their way towards you, you don't think, maybe this will work out. That's like a pretty ominous thing, right? So maybe it's kind of vague, but the connotation is definitely dark. Like, you don't think of that as neutral, I don't think. George R. Martin was an avid reader of comics, and there was a character created in the 40s called Black Hood, who was very popular. He even had his own radio serial. And this was an Archie Comics production before it was called Archie Comics, but it was eventually integrated into DC and even in the Riverdale TV show. Yeah, Black Hood was in the Riverdale TV show. How wild is that? So he was created in the 40s and still around in this Riverdale TV show, are they still making Riverdale, that TV show? I know that it was fairly recent.
And it had a really crazy ending. I'll tell you about it after the stream.
Okay.
But however crazy you think this ending is, it's so much more like wild than you could conceive of.
So his Black Hood is like it's nothing compared to that stuff.
Nothing compared to this.
Wild. Anyway, the Black Hood drove the Hood cycle. Nice, the Hood cycle, and the Hood later made the Black Hood, like this. He made an actual object called the Black Hood, and it was a cursed object. Like it was like a Zorro-ish kind of thing, or like the Shrouded Lord situation where whoever wears it becomes the next Black Hood, but it was cursed, like it had a personality of its own. It would impart like evil into the wearer. There's also a Black Hood magic item in the game Elden Ring, which George contributed to, some world building and stuff, but that might just be a coincidence. I mean, Black Hood isn't that specific a thing, but hey, maybe that's from George. Let's talk about Mad Danelle. The most famous of Lostons, most likely. There's room between Manfred and Danelle on the timeline in terms of maybe Mad Danelle isn't Manfred's daughter. He might be her sister. He might be his sister, rather. And there's not so much space in between them on the timeline that we have to have someone between them there. There's room for another generation, but we don't have to. I'm going to assume there wasn't. I'm going to assume it went from Manfred to Danelle, and that's it. By 212, Danelle Lothston was Lady of Harrenhal. So, yeah, we don't actually know when Manfred died. By the time Sir Eustace was talking about Manfred's betrayal, Manfred may have already been dead. But Sir Eustace was talking about Manfred's betrayal in the year 210. That's when the Sworn Sword takes place. So, yeah, Danelle could have been a sister or daughter of Manfred, like I said. She could have also been like a cousin. Who knows? We don't have a lot of idea how old she was, so it's hard to nail down, especially because she was rumored to bathe in blood to preserve her age, which that throws off aging even more, right? Like, even if we assume that didn't work, well, maybe she looked young because something is causing people to say this about her, even if it's not nearly the truth. So if she was Manfred's sister, then it applies Manfred died without issue or his children predeceased him, which opens up the possibility of murder. Maybe Danelle killed Manfred's children and took the castle for herself, but that's pretty big speculation. And the same things are possible if she was Manfred's daughter. Like maybe she had older brothers and killed them, or one older brother and killed him. But that's just totally random. There's no suggestion she's a kinslayer. I'm just saying we can't rule it out, right? It's just one of the more salacious possibilities. It's entirely possible that Harrenhal just did its thing. There were very few descendants, and she was the oldest, and it's that simple. And there's another element that could really throw this whole thing off. Not throw it off, but make things worse, which is the Great Spring Sickness, right? The Great Spring Sickness killed a lot of people. It was particularly bad in the Riverlands, where Harrenhal is. And Harrenhal is known for being, damp, humid, maybe. So possibly more susceptible to something like the Great Spring Sickness. So yeah, that could have hit them pretty hard. The Lostons might have been doing pretty well before that, and all of a sudden there's very few Lostons left. And that may be, in fact, the precise event that moved the castle from Manfred's lordship to Danelle's ladyship. Just like Manfred, we have no idea who she married, if anyone, which would certainly add to her reputation if she chose to not marry. And it also wouldn't help the house continue, though. Here's when we actually see her briefly, though. Quote,
From Maidenpool had come Lord Mooten, from Raventree Lord Blackwood, from Duskendale Lord Darklyn. The royal domains about King's Landing sent forth Hayfords, Rosbys, Stokeworths, Masseys, and the king's own sworn swords, led by 3 knights of the King's Guard and stiffened by 300 ravens' teeth with tall, white weirwood bows. Mad Danelle Lothston herself rode forth in strength from her haunted towers at Harrenhal, clad in black armor that fit her like an iron glove, her long red hair streaming.
Quite a striking figure. Like Lord Mooten, Lord Blackwood, Lord Darklyn, all these names, but only one person gets a description and a specific first name here out of all these people. She's way the most striking. It inspires people like Ashea herself to dress this way, which I believe is now on screen. How cool is that? Look at this. Ashea as Mad Danelle Lothston. Less mad, more Lothston.
I also have to the right art of Danelle by Lady Ray Laverne, and that's on the wiki, and it's a case of art imitating life, because that piece came after my cosplay.
Yeah, we're pretty sure that Ray got a little inspiration from your cosplay.
No, I'm positive. I'm friends with Ray.
Oh, you're positive.
I'm friends with Ray. Yeah.
I misunderstood when you said it before. So definitely, that's awesome. Yeah, very cool. So yeah, thanks to Ray for shouting out Ashea's look there. It looks great, and she still has that costume. Yeah, the armor is still. I told
Aziz he should wear it today.
Yeah, I thought about it, but it's not the most comfortable thing. Armor is rarely comfortable. So. Red hair, not uncommon in the Riverlands, so by itself, maybe that doesn't say a lot, but we do have some things to say about it. The Stokeworths would be her kin, of course, and she descends from Felina, and they get mentioned here, so that's kind of fun. And again, she might have been Targaryen, right? If she descends from Aegon the Unworthy, then, which is very possible, then she might have Targaryen blood. But there's no mention of her husband either. There's no mention of, like, Lady Lothston with her husband blankety blank or anything. Just rode forth in strength. No sons, no relatives, just her apparently, which is interesting. Just maybe she has one of her relatives running the castle while she's gone, or maybe her castellan is from a completely unrelated house. Maybe it's House Went. It's also more evidence that the Lostons were powerful. Right? This is not This is not House Towers. This is not a house that's unable to afford their castle, so they become a non-factor. She rode forth in strength, it said. You don't have lots of soldiers and arms and weapons and armor if your house is impoverished, most likely. They are potentially still benefiting from Lucas's pandering. In other words, the rewards heaped upon this family from Aegon IV are probably still in play here, and possibly because those are providing income. Like if he gave them more land, which is the most likely thing, then yeah, they're getting passive income from all that. Maybe not passive income, but income from all that, semi-passive income to pay for all these things. Now, during the Second Blackfyre Rebellion, which is what this is describing, right? This is the end of the Mystery Night that we're seeing in that quote. Dunk overheard earlier in the short story that they expected Danelle to join them. Instead, she comes in strength against them, which might be political. She might know that she is perceived as a possible Blackfyre loyalist, so she does everything she can to throw off that notion. Say, no, I'm showing up in strength to support the king. I am putting these Blackfyre rumors to rest. And given the uncertain nature of how things played out during the first rebellion, with Manfred switching sides, Lady Danelle might have wanted to make a very strong statement of who she supported, very public, very well known. Again, she makes a striking figure, so it's kind of easy for her to be, I want to make sure I'm noticed. For me, that's easy. I am very noticeable, so this shouldn't be too hard. Let me just ride to war in my fitting armor with my long red hair. Very few people are going to look like that on the battlefield. There's very few women on the battlefield. I'm going to be in charge of these men, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to make a striking figure. She knows what she's doing. She knows she's going to be seen. She's not wearing a helmet. Her hair is streaming behind her. Yeah, well, or if she is wearing a helmet, you can still see her hair. So that's interesting that the Blackfyre conspirators thought she would join and then very much didn't. So maybe they thought that if they won, that she was going to, maybe they were right. Maybe she would have joined if things actually went well. I mean, if we're being honest, this whole thing was a disaster. So why would she join them at this point? Maybe she was planning to join, and this is why she came out so strong against them, because she's worried Bloodraven might know. She's really got to be public about this. Take no chances. So they saw the Blackfyres as finished and want to make sure that they're among those to spit on their graves, so that they are seen doing that. And again, if she's going to be, let me say this again. If she's going to get taken down in about 20 years after this, which is what happens, she loses her seat roughly 20 years after this, maybe 15, something like that. She may have already been on thin ice. She may have already had a bad reputation. Her family probably did, despite her. So given she's going to lose her seat not that long after, we can imagine that maybe she was already feeling that pressure. Maybe there was already people coming after her. Maybe there was already, the rumors were started. Notice that quote says, Mad Danelle Lothston came forth. Mad Danelle, this is the year 212. We're told that she lost her seat because she turned to the dark arts. Well, but she's already called mad in this era before she turned to the dark arts. So that's a little curious. Not like a flaw, but it implies that she had a reputation before she even turned to the dark arts. Now, Nina has a great theory here. It's possible that, like Visenya and maybe Alice Rivers, who is even has a greater connection here in a lot of ways because of, well, Harrenhal, obviously, maybe Danelle turned to magic or dark arts to have a child, to try to force a pregnancy or to conjure a pregnancy. Again, that's why I bring up Visenya, because, yeah, Visenya might have done that with Maegor, and that's why we talked about Maegor the way we did at the beginning of this episode, why Guy Lothston might have been attached to him, not just as a way to show this house is always associated with evil, whether it's Maegor, whether it's curses, whether it's cannibalism, whether it's blood magic, whether it's pandering, whether it's gross, incestuous, sexual things. So with Visenya's rumoring that, Visenya just had Maegor when she was 40 and Aegon couldn't seem to conceive. It's peculiar. We've talked about it elsewhere, and I'm big on this theory as a potential. Certainly not enough to say it's a sure thing, but yeah, the Lawsons definitely held on to their dynastic stability for longer than the Towers, but they still ended up without heirs here, apparently, or very few heirs. Because again, if you have a lady inheriting, that already implies that there's a dearth of men. Obviously, there's nothing wrong. Obviously, in our mind, men and women should be equal in terms of ruling, but that's not how it works in Westeros. So there is something you can imply whenever a woman inherits, that there were no men or something else happened. So I do love Nina's theory here that the idea is that Danelle was maybe doing some delving into the dark arts to try to get pregnant. And this would establish her as another of the witch queen archetypes, all of whom exist at Harrenhal pretty much. Obviously, Visenya's not Harrenhal, but we don't really call Visenya a witch queen. She's just more of a dragon queen with a slice of magic maybe thrown in, whereas the magic stuff is a lot more explicit with someone like Alice Rivers or Danelle Lothston. Rhaena has a little of those vibes too. She doesn't really have the magic, but she's a dragon queen, dragon lord, dragon lady, and lived at Harrenhal and had some association. So definitely interesting to think about that. And the whole Guy Lothston Maegor thing. By the way, Maegor looked like he was dying after his trial by 7, and it was only after Visenya came with Tiana the Tower, brought Tiana the Tower in, that Maegor's health turned positively all of a sudden. It's always been a little suspicious there, too, that magic was involved. So, yes. All these things are wrapped together. A huge open question for us in general, but also for this episode, is the third Blackfyre Rebellion. It was glossed over in the histories for what we think are pretty obvious reasons. George wanted to not commit. He wanted to think about it later. It's too important for him to just toss a few ideas out and then be stuck on that. He doesn't want to commit to anything. So in the histories, it's presented as, we all know that story. Whenever he says we all know that story, we pretty much never do. But it's a clue that George wants to not commit. He wants to think about it more later, which is fine. You know, we got to give him some room for that from time to time. It would be a problem if he did that too often, but it's cool here. Even though we really want to know what happened in the Third Blackfyre Rebellion. But it really relates to Lady Danelle. This is definitely Lady Danelle in charge in this era still. Because the Third Blackfyre Rebellion happened during the reign of King Aerys, and we know she was still in charge until the reign of King Maegor, who would be next. So maybe she did actually join the rebels in the Third. Maybe this is part of what put her on a slippery slope, was fighting for the wrong side. Because in this case, it was a close-run thing. The Third Blackfyre Rebellion was almost won by the Blackfyres. It's hard to imagine someone signing up for a losing cause. It's a lot easier to imagine someone signing up for either side when both sides are pretty equally matched. That's a real hard choice. If your goal is, I want to be on the winning side, and it's hard to tell who's stronger, what do? Well, you might pull a Butterwell or a Hightower or one of these houses that in different wars have supported both sides. That's what you might do. And maybe that's on the table here as well for the Lothstons. I'm not sure. But this, if they supported the rebels, if they supported the Blackfyres here, the Lothstons during the Third Blackfyre Rebellion, that would really help us explain why they were on shaky ground with Maegor later. That would be part of the many reasons why this house needs to go. We don't need that reason, but it would certainly go a long way towards establishing that. And since they're always heels, since they seem to always be bad guys, that's a strike against them maybe fighting for the loyalists here. You know, the guys that just started a war because they didn't like Dorne and didn't like maesters and Dorne and the king having a pot belly, you know. I find the Blackfyres fascinating, but I'm very much on the red side here in terms of who was in the right about that war. In the beginning of this episode, I mentioned something about Jaime and how when he gets news about some of the worst people he's ever heard of and what they're up to, he thinks of Danelle Lothston. So here we go with that. He's thinking of Gregor and Vargo. When Gregor made Vargo eat people, including himself, and when Gregor made other people eat parts of Vargo. Forced cannibalism, right? Disgusting. He hears about this, and it triggers a memory of Mad Danelle Lothston. Quote,
"Father," Jaime thought, "your dogs have both gone mad." He found himself remembering tales he had first heard as a child at Casterly Rock of mad Lady Lothston who bathed in tubs of blood and presided over feasts of human flesh within these very walls. Somehow revenge had lost its savor. "Take this and throw it in the lake." Jaime tossed Hote's head to peck and turned to address the garrison.
So there's the cannibalism, yep, that we mentioned in the beginning, that Harrenhal's associated with cannibalism. Now, there's a specific example, right? But that's a current example. That happens during the series. Harrenhal already had the reputation prior to this, but, good way to bring it all back and to reestablish that reputation, right? Yikes. A fun question, maybe not fun, but fun in quotes, is these so-called baths of blood that Lady Lothston had. Was this the same tub that Jaime and Brienne were in? Is this the same place these so-called baths were taking place while they're talking about it? Are they in the very bath where it happened? It's possible. It's very possible. Very possible. Now, bathing in blood has a lot of connotations. It's not simply straightforward as, a woman's trying to recover her age. But that is one of the reasons. It could be it. Sanrixian, by the way, we got some art from her here. The great Sanrixian with some bathing in blood. Specifically bathing in blood art for Lady Danelle. Shout out to Sanrixian. So it could be exactly what it sounds like, in other words. Yes, it actually could be she bathed in blood to preserve her youth. A couple of questions, though, whether it works is a separate question to whether or not it's magical. If it's magical, I'm guessing it works, but it probably isn't. Although maybe other things she does are magical, and those might work. I'm not so sure about this one. Several characters have said to bathe in blood. Whether they actually did or not, I'm not sure. Of all of them, she might be the most likely to have actually done it. Shiera Seastar is said to have bathed in blood. Daenerys is said to have bathed in blood. We know Daenerys didn't. We've seen in her chapters. She's gotten really bloody. Maybe certain things she's done that could say we could symbolically say that, but not literally. She did not take a bath in a tub filled with blood. She definitely didn't do that. And I kind of doubt Shiera Seastar did either, but maybe. I'm also skeptical here, but definitely she's at the top of the list of anyone I've heard of doing this that might actually have done so. Our common mundane explanation, we like to do that. We like to have the most supernatural explanation we can think of, which would be that, hey, it actually worked. Bathing in blood restored her youth or kept her young. Maybe it did. The most mundane explanation has nothing to do with magic or intent even, is that she was just dyeing her hair. And it looks bloody, and it looks like her head gets on her skin from a distance. Some servant or multiple servants see that, and all the red is dripping from her head. It looks like she's bathed in blood. She might have dipped her head in it or something, what does a hair dye process look to an ignorant commoner of, who's an employee at Harrenhal that is not given an education and has Lady Danelle as her lord, or lady rather, and given all the other stuff the Lostons are associated with, it's less of a jump to something like this. So yeah, maybe that was all there is to it. Just regular old hair dye. And of course, no hair dye exists in the setting. Sansa has dyed her hair, and other people have dyed their hairs. It's fairly common, in fact, but not amongst peasants. That's very expensive, presumably. It's not like today where you can get hair dye for, a couple, $30 or something. Anyway, or more, but not some huge amount. Now, we're told she, quote, turned to the black arts. That's a direct quote. And that their line ended in, quote, chaos and madness. What does that mean? The madness part, we're like, okay, well, Harrenhal has that effect on some people. If she was, maybe she got some disease and it got in her brain and made her mad. But who's the mad person here? What's the chaos? This is very vague, very interesting. But yeah, it's hard to sink your teeth into it like a vampire, right? Was it one event? Was it one big, that's the last... She can't be doing that? Or was it just a lot of little things that finally they had enough of it, like the straw that broke the camel's back? And again, close to King's Landing. That's the problem here for her. If she's doing all these things way off in the Dreadfort or way off in the Iron Islands, you might get away with it. Maegor might hear about it, but this is close to the castle. And Maegor is a guy that is a hands-on kind of dude. Remember that Maegor died putting down the Peak Rebellion. So if Danelle was brought down under his reign, he probably led the army himself. If he's going to go all the way to the south to fight the Peaks, he's probably going to go to Harrenhal, which is way closer. And Nina adds, I tend to think Maegor's reign was in part about reversing the executive inaction and failure of feudal protection that had defined the reign of Aerys I, who was the predecessor, right? Aerys I was a bookish king that just told everyone else to just handle things for him, right? So Maegor was very different than that. He was much more hands-on. So this is a very good point here. Whether this was the factor for this case, for the Lothston scenario, is up in the air, but I definitely agree with Nina that in general, Maegor ruled very differently, in part because that's just who he is, but also in part because of who his brother was, which was the most relaxed, hands-off king we may have had of all time. I mean, these are the peaks. We also had Dagon Greyjoy during that era, right? Dagon Greyjoy ran rampant for a while under King Aerys. And Lothstons, whatever they were doing, whatever she was getting away with, she got away with it for a little while. So this might be Maegor saying, look, you can't get away with this sort of thing so close to me. I'm not going to turn a blind eye to much, especially not to something that's happening right under my nose like this. The problem is, scapegoating magic, I don't know that that's enough of an answer. Yeah, okay, that she turned to the dark arts. She's trying to conceive a child through magic. That could get some attention and bring people down. But Maegor employed Bloodraven as his hand. Bloodraven had a reputation from sorcery. Now, what sorcery was Bloodraven actually employing in this era? I don't know. Definitely some, though. We see him do glamours. And he had the reputation for it, too. So what the public believed about Bloodraven versus what's actually true is there's got to be some disconnect. But there's some level of truth in the belief that Bloodraven was using magic. That reputation Maegor would be aware of. Maegor wasn't a big fan of Bloodraven, probably, but kept him on because of political necessity, maybe because he grudgingly respected how effective he was, and if he's going to be a hands-on king, then Bloodraven's going to be really helpful for that. But still, employing a guy who's a known sorcerer makes it difficult to say that he went after Lady Danelle because of sorcery. Right? That's just something about that doesn't feel right. Shiera Seastar, again, also had a reputation for bathing in blood. She lived at court at the same time as all this. So how is Danelle going to be singled out for this when people at court are maybe doing the same things, right? Even closer to Maegor? So I got to think there's more to it. Maybe too many infractions, too much violence, too many other things, like something that affects other people. If you're only doing things that affect you, even if they give you a bad reputation, maybe that's more acceptable. But it's these stories that Jaime and others tell later that might be our clue, which are stories of kidnapping children, which might have been actual kidnappings and not just stories. That's a much more serious crime. Sure, there's a lot of cynicism, and we should be right to be cynical about Westerosi ladies and lords and justice for peasants, right? A lot of times, you might be like, come on, Aziz, this lady rounds up a few peasants and does awful things to them. She could get away with that. Yeah, she could. She might. But what if she went a little too far and people started to talk about it a lot? She's a woman, so like the patriarchal society, the stories might triple or quadruple because of who it's coming from. And again, the proximity argument is huge here. So whether Lady Danelle deserved her reputation or not, or maybe she deserved something like it, it was probably exaggerated, even if there was a lot of truth to it, because it's such a scandalous thing. It's such the kind of thing people would talk about. And if people are going to talk about it, it's going to get exaggerated. Rumor always works that way, right? And if we're comparing it to something like, well, where Jaime comes from, if we're comparing it to Casterly Rock, you can keep information somewhat tied down in Casterly Rock. It's a mountain. There's ways in and out that can be guarded. Harrenhal is this giant ruinous castle with Arya got out with one fake silver coin. She drops it on the ground. The guard goes to pick it up. She cuts his throat. She got out, right? A couple of kids escaped from Harrenhal. It's not the same as Casterly Rock. The scenario is very different. So point being, lots of different stories can leak out of Harrenhal in ways that other lords might be able to control information more tightly. Both the proximity to King's Landing and the nature of the size of the castle and its leakiness both work against keeping secrets there. So I can imagine a scenario where Maegor hears complaints about Lady Danelle on a regular basis or semi-regular basis, and eventually he just gets fed up, like, okay, that's enough. I've had enough hearing about this woman. We're going to go take her down. And there may have been other reasons, like she doesn't have a descendant or she doesn't have children anyway, so like it's going to happen. We need to replace her anyway. This castle is going to become empty regardless. He might go months without hearing someone mention the Boltons or the Ironborn. And even if he did hear about them, he might be like, delegate. Tell someone else to take care of that. Let the Greyjoys handle that. Let the Starks handle that. Like, even for him, that might be too far away. Interestingly, no one else has ever had the name Danelle that we know of. There have been plenty of other, Manfreds and Lucases, but Danelle is unique, as far as we know. There are some similar ones, like there's plenty of Dan this, like Daenerys. Nina suggests maybe she was even called Dany as a nickname. Yeah, absolutely. Could be. Very, very possible. Magel is, there's the ELL suffixes there, or Danwell, which is, you got the L sound and the Dan. So there's some similar names, but yeah, no actual other Danelles anywhere in Westeros, at least yet. Some of you may be aware, maybe because you've heard of her or you've heard this mentioned before on our show or elsewhere, that Elizabeth Bathory is the inspiration for Lady Danelle. Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noble in the 16th, 17th centuries who was accused and condemned for killing something like 600 peasants, torturing, bathing in blood, awful stuff, really horrible. However, there's a serious scholarly effort to consider whether or not this is actually fact. I've read this in two different ways. Either she owed the king a lot of money or the king owed her a lot of money. I think the other one makes more sense. If she owed the king a lot of money, then why would they kill her? They would want to get that money. But there's a very strong chance that this was a drummed up story to take her land. In part because, yes, the king may have owed her money, and the king is the one who ordered this investigation right after her husband died. So supposedly she killed 600 people, yet no one heard anything about it until after her husband died. It's very suspicious. The counter arguments are very strong here. But we're not here to settle whether Elizabeth Bathory is guilty or not. That's not important to us. But what's important to us is some of these elements are possible here. I think it's more likely Matt Danelle really did do blood magic and some of these other stuff, because that's just more fun for the story to have some of these supernatural elements. George likes to turn it up to 11. But there's room for both. There's room for the truth to be only a kernel and the real story to be, or the truth to be a kernel and the rumor to be a massively exaggerated version of this. Like maybe she was actually mad. Again, the mad stories started before the magic stories. And one may have been true and the other might not have been. Maybe she really did use magic but wasn't mad. Maybe she didn't use magic but was mad. Maybe she was both. I prefer kind of both. That's maybe the most fun, to have someone that's both really magical and kind of mad, because all sorts of weird stuff happen when you have skill with magic and you're kind of crazy. That's just, hey, you can have a lot of fun with that as a storyteller. Of course, George's call, obviously, we're just going with we're picking up what he's put down so far, but he's got more to put down, and at which point we'll pick that back up. So it's very interesting to consider that some of the stories about Mad Danelle might not be true or just exaggerated, just like the inspiration for her. The stuff is also on the table, that maybe Elizabeth Bathory didn't do any of that stuff. This may have just been the High Lords playing their Game of Thrones by telling stories about each other. We have a lot of bonus episodes out there. If you are wanting to catch our bonus episodes, sign up for our Patreon. We are able to do kind of off the beaten path episodes like this thanks to you all. If it weren't for you all, we'd either have to do a lot more mainstream topics, which we do plenty of as well, or we wouldn't just be doing this at all. Or maybe we just wouldn't be able to make a living out of this and we just wouldn't be here at all. So you all are what makes this possible, and we try to give back to you when you sign up to be a patron. You can sign up at patreon.com/History of Westeros and get a lot of our bonus episodes. Well, all of our bonus episodes. I don't know how many we have. It's a lot. It's in the double digits. And we've got topics like the Red Kraken, the follow-up to the Red Kraken. We've got some compilations from our Valar Regis where you can listen to all the Arya chapters together, or all the Jon chapters together, or all the Dany chapters, and quite a few other things. Shout-outs, your name on our website, and of course, just the satisfaction of supporting something that you engage in. I am a patron of all the shows that I listen to regularly as well. So, I'm not just a patron. I am a patron subscriber. Let's talk about the last Lothston. Because there is a reason to believe there was one more Lothston after Danelle. Maybe not a Lord Lothston, but probably a Lord Lothston. But whether they actually held the castle is also up in the air. The reason is from that very first quote from Gendry that we read at the beginning, the first mention. He said that Ben Blackthumb was a blacksmith to the last Lord Lothston. Not lady, Lord. Very possible that Gendry assumed a man. That Ben Blackthumb said the last Lothston. And he just thought that was a lord, because odds are it is going to be a lord. Most of the rulers of castles are men. So he doesn't, if a gender isn't specified, Gendry it wouldn't be the dumbest thing ever for him to assume a man. It would be a mistake, but, unreliable narrator, that's got to happen sometimes, right? It's also possible that Danelle's husband was styled Lord Lothston, and he was allowed to run the castle for a little while before it all fell apart after her. Maybe Tyrek Lannister does that. Bronn does that. And Maybe Danelle did have a son who tried to claim Harrenhal later, but was deposed by Maegor. And of course, it's also possibly just a mistake by George. But I don't like calling something a mistake unless we just can't reconcile it. And we can. Gendry just messing up is a very rational, simple, and reasonable explanation. But so is there being one more Lothston afterwards that had to be hunted down and killed. Maybe he wasn't at Harrenhal. Someone who tried to start a rebellion to reclaim his title. Anyway, lots of possibilities there. Maybe we'll find out. Here's another little clue, though. Let's get back to our friend Sir Illiffer from one of our favorite POVs, Brienne. Quote.
Sir Illiffer crooked a bony finger at her shield. Though its paint was cracked and peeling, the device it bore showed plain. A black bat on a field divided bendwise, silver and gold. You bear a liar's shield, to which you have no right. My grandfather's grandfather helped kill the last of Lothston. None since has dared to show that bat, black as the deeds of them that bore it.
He then goes on to name Lord Lucas and Manfred of the Black Hood and accuses her of cloaking herself in shame because she's guilty of killing Renly. So there's two things going on here. One, he's upset to see her wearing a sigil that doesn't belong to her. He's upset because of what sigil that is, because it's such a dark sigil, and he recognizes her as the one that's accused of killing Renly. And yeah, so he pulls his dagger. But she talks her way out of it. She swears an oath. It's a great scene. They're like, oh, great oath there. That's a really good swearing. Well, if she's lying, the gods will sort her out. Our work is done here. I love that. But Sir Illiffer is probably lying or exaggerating, which we already knew that. Both of these guys, Creighton and Illiffer, are teller of tall tales. That's their whole shtick. Like, it's half the reason we see them. You know, they're part of the background of the Hedge Knight story, the questing knight. They're like a traditional element here from this type of story that George is adapting within A Song of Ice and Fire, Brienne's quest. So the reason I'm pretty sure he's lying or exaggerating is he says his grandfather's grandfather helped kill the last of Lothston. Illiffer's probably like 50, if not 60, which is when the Lothstons fell. How is his grandfather's grandfather alive 60 years ago when he was born? Like, I don't think so. Was his grandfather's grandfather did all his grandfathers have children at age 16 or something? Even that probably doesn't make it work. Anyway, it doesn't. So he's lying about his involvement, but given his age, he absolutely was around for those stories. When it was really happening, he would have been a young man, or right after it happened, he would have been a young man. So he would have grown up right after the fall of Lothston. It would have been a big deal for storytelling. Like, people still tell stories about Mad Danelle now. Imagine right after her fall. Those stories would have been even more popular, even more common. She would have been one of the most scandalous topics to speak on, probably, in the Riverlands, if not a lot of places. What an outstanding character, even in world. Like, to us, she's outstanding, but in world, she would really stand out quite a lot too. He would have heard those tales all about the cook pots and her bats kidnapping children and the bathing and all that. Fresh story too, and one that happened not far from where this quote occurs. They're on the road to Duskendale in this chapter. And again, Duskendale's just up the coast. So Harrenhal's still, even though they've left King's Landing, they're still only about 2 weeks ride from King's Landing. Or they're two weeks ride from Harrenhal, rather, from the road to Duskendale. One theory I like is that King Maegor himself, or maybe he sent Bloodraven, maybe, or something like that, removed Danelle, either had her killed or sent to the Silent Sisters, and then installed another Lothston, and then this new Lothston was also terrible, so they removed him and just said, no more Lothstons. Maybe they ran out of Lothstons. Maybe there just weren't any more. Again, a lot of smaller possibilities here. We're cycling through our options, and pretty good. Now, we're told that their own household knights turned on them. The House Went turned on House Lothston during this era. So, in fact, they might be the initial impetus for this fall. Maybe they went to the king and were like, look, I can tell you, because we're on the inside, we've seen some real bad stuff that they've done. And yes, we're loyal to our overlords, but we just had to say something. She's killing kids. She's kidnapping babies. She's doing blood magic. I don't know what they said or if they said it at all, but I like this theory because we know they got Harrenhal. So the way it tends to work is the people that do the most work or do the pivotal thing or who turn first, like the River Lords did for Aegon the Conqueror. Which River Lord got the biggest reward? The first River Lord that turned to Aegon, which was Edmund Tully. So if House Went was the first to turn on the Lostons and side with the king, it would absolutely fit that they got the biggest reward, which, well, they did get the biggest reward. So we kind of have to work our way backward and say, well, why did House Went get such a big reward? Probably because they were really crucial in overthrowing the Lostons or did something really important or something that made a big difference, right? And of course, the bats still live on with House Went, right? The bats are their sigil too. But of course, during the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, House Went loses Harrenhal as well. But there's definitely still bats there. So the sigil is still accurate. There is a John Lothston in the Golden Company, but y'all don't forget the nature and makeup of the Golden Company. People call themselves whatever. There's also Strongs in the Golden Company, so that's kind of funny. What happens if the Golden Company wins Harrenhal and they're like the Lothston, John Lothston's like, hey, I get this, right? And the Strongs are like, no, we get this. We're the Strongs. We get here. It's like, no, but my house had it more recently. Yeah, but there's 3 of us and just one of you, John Lothston. So I don't know. That could be a little thing later. The Lothston legacy is our final section here. As we said early on, they had it for more than any other house, something like 80 years. And in that time, it's hard to name a single positive, uplifting, or good thing they did, a single good person even, right? Not just a good deed, but like a single character that isn't bad or at least severely tarnished. On the other side of the ledger is full of dark deeds, right? The list is lengthy and varied. Again, cannibalism, blood magic, incest, selling your own children for favors, murder. Yeah, just the list is huge. I don't have to go through all of them again, but you get it. So 70-some years after losing Harrenhal and probably dying out, because that John Lothston probably isn't a descendant, but maybe he is. Maybe he's an exception. Regardless, they are nowhere near forgotten. Their sigil still comes off like a bad omen. I'm very amused by what happens here with Jaime. George has Jaime make a small but very on point, very thematic mistake here, one that doesn't harm him in the slightest, but is very funny. Quote,
"He found an old shield in the armory, battered and splintered, the chipped paint still showing most of the great black bat of House Lothston upon a field of silver and gold. The Lothstons held Harrenhal before the Wents and had been a powerful family in their day, but they had died out ages ago, so no one was likely to object to him bearing their arms. He would be no one's cousin, no one's enemy, no one's sworn sword. In sum, no one."
Who does he think he is, Arya? He is trying to be in the disguise, so there's some Arya vibes there. And this is Harrenhal, where Arya also was, right? But of all the shields he could claim, well, that's the authorial hand at work here. George is really making moves here. This is like 3rd level subtlety, at least. He specifically wanted an extinct house, Jaime did, so no one would like call him out or whatever. And he is like a bat out of hell leaving Harrenhal, so there's a little symbolism there too. But he's like, no, this will not attract attention. I'll be a no one. It does the exact opposite. It attracts a lot of attention. We already see it attract attention for Brienne. And there's actually 2 more examples that we're going to read. So it was a poor choice by Jaime in that regard, but he's not the one who deals with that. He doesn't ever maybe realize that he made this mistake. And of course, it's a very small mistake, but it's a funny one. It's funnier because he's aware. He's heard the horror stories. He's like, I know about Mad Danelle. I thought of her when Vargo Hoat and Gregor were brought up to me about cannibalism and all that. So he knows what the deal is with that sigil. Like, he knows what it represents, but he still thinks it's not a big deal. He doesn't see the symbolism, I guess, you know. It makes for a better mistake, too. It makes for a good story. So this is George being really clever by having Jaime do this, and let's move forward and see where it leads. What he does next is, right after he decides he can't personally fulfill the vow to Lady Catelyn, he's like, well, the next best thing I can do is help Brienne do it. So I can sort of be fulfilling my vow to Lady Catelyn by sending a competent person to do this job, someone who's very dedicated to it. Like, there's no doubt Brienne is going to try her hardest to find Sansa and Arya. So he gives her money, that letter, and gear to go find Lady Catelyn's daughters, including the sword, right, Oathkeeper, and the shield. This Lothston shield, it's kind of lost in the shuffle because there's all these like outstanding important things. Like Brienne's like, all right, cool, money, a new saddle, a Valyrian steel sword. Oh, and that weird ass bat shield.
Lothston in the shuffle.
Dang, good one. Good pun. Lothston in the shuffle. Very nice. So yeah, Brienne is in turn accosted not once, not twice, but like 3 times for the shield. 3 different people commented on it. Remember, Jaime thinks no one is likely to object. Several people objected, Jaime. The narrator voice is big in this one, right? Several people objected. Yeah, no, Gendry did not, in fact, stay there. Several people did, in fact, object. So the first accosting we already heard from Sir Illifer. Here's the next accosting. Quote,
the captain's eyes lingered on her shield.
the black bat of Lothston. Those are arms of ill repute.
They are not mine. I mean to have the shield repainted.
Of course, his tone shifts dramatically after that because this captain's sister is a painter. And he's like, oh, go give my sister some business. He's like, let her pass, right? So she goes to his sister and brings the shield and she reacts to it too. Here we go, quote.
She had a cheerful manner, but when Brienne showed her the shield, her face went dark. My old ma used to say that giant bats flew out from Harrenhal on moonless nights to carry bad children to Mad Danelle for her cookpots. Sometimes I'd hear them scrabbling at the shutters. She sucked her teeth a moment, thoughtful. What goes in its place?
So this is like a Westeros boogeyman story. People started to use Lady Danelle as an enduring story of what you do if you don't obey your parents. Kind of similar to the old Nan stories that we hear at the beginning, but one of the darker ones, you know. But some of old Nan's are pretty dark. Now, what goes in its place is the question asked by the painter, and of course, it is painted just like Duncan the Tall's shield, which also had wings, but not bat wings, a winged chalice. It's a lot more positive than a bat in this setting. Now, that's Duncan. Not Duncan the Tall's shield didn't have wings. I mean that Duncan the Tall's master, Sir Arlen's shield, had wings. So that's really neat that as part of the parallel to Brienne and Dunk, and of course, most of us here believe that Brienne is Dunk's ancestor. One of the first things they both do when they're introduced with their own POVs is to have their shield painted. Dunk goes to have Sir Arlen's shield repainted into the very same shield that Brienne has her shield painted into, which is the shooting star and the tree. And so that's cool. They both have their shield repainted. Now, Dunk's shield wasn't repainted away from something evil, but he actually thinks at first that the new version with the comet and the tree in the nighttime, he actually is like, oh, this is, quote, all painted up like death. Until Pate talks about, he's like, no, that's a tree. It's a living tree. This is life. This is good. And then that sets Dunk to rights. He's like, okay, good point. And then he starts to look at it more happily and positively. But it's kind of neat that it has that sort of reverse situation here where he gets this nice shield repainted, and at first he thinks it's grim, whereas Brienne gets this grim shield repainted over into this new version that is the same thing that Dunk has. Nice symbolism here too. With in Brienne's case, she's covering over evil with good. She's turning evil into good, which is a lot of what she's about. I mean, she is a very good person. She's on a good person's quest, and she's, you know, fighting evil, right? And using the tools of evil against them. It's kind of neat. I like that. So the Lothston legacy is a house sufficiently villainous to be the sample villain, the opposite. Like, you need to be a sufficiently villainous villain. You need that for a hero to be sufficiently heroic. And if you want Brienne, which she is, to stand out as a big hero, then the villains have to be pretty big too. And Dunk also started, and not Dunk, but yes, Dunk. Duncan Lucas Lothston both started off roughly as hedge knights or descendants from hedge knights with connection to House Targaryen. In this case, one of the worst Targaryens for the Lostons, Aegon the Unworthy, and one of the best for Sir Duncan and Egg. So some of their experience was based on which Targaryen they had a lot of association with. But I think that it's not unlikely, in fact, it's likely that the Dunk and Egg stories will take us to Harrenhal during the era of Mad Danelle. Very likely. Right? How can George resist bringing her into the story when she's been mentioned? In fact, in 2015, someone asked that. Someone said to George in an interview, or not an interview, at a convention, asked him, one of my favorite characters is Mad Danelle. She's super interesting. Will we ever see her in a short story? And he said, well, we might see her in Dunk and Egg. No promises, though. So he was pretty quick with the answer. One of the reasons I'm dying for Dunk to go to Harrenhal is because of his saying, Dunk the Tall, thick as a castle wall. I'm not so sure if he's thick as those walls. That is
yes,
one cat.
He is.
Shay's like, nah, Zeus,
no
you're
doubt. Thick with 2 C's.
Okay, we disagree on that one. So, yeah, the Targaryens Lothston Association created the evil black bats of Harrenhal, while the Targaryen Duncan the Tall scenario created the white-cloaked good knight of the Kingsguard. So, yeah, it goes opposite ways. So yeah, in a few summary elements here. As we did earlier, we compared them to houses like Bolton and Peake, and to a lesser extent, houses like Uller and Bracken that are mostly villainous. Uller isn't 100% villainous, neither is Bracken, but mostly villainous, mostly dark, mostly dangerous, if not straight up evil. Very few good things said about them. Now, did the castle make them this way over the generations? I mean, Lucas was kind of already a scumbag, it seems like. Maybe power went to his head. So did it happen slowly or over time? Did the power go to their head, that ruling this important castle, this dark castle that they associated with their own personalities or their own vibe? Did supernatural mean slowly ruin them? Or was it just the straight up generic being spoiled by power? As usual, we have to say that it's quite possible that it's both. Did they fall from status and privilege not because of Harrenhal, but because they were corrupted by its power? That's entirely possible too. Or corrupted by the health impacts of the lack of ability to bear children. You know, maybe it's just as simple as that. Harrenhal did for another family because they couldn't procreate. But I have a feeling that when we learn more, it won't be that simple. It's more fun to bring out the supernatural elements now, but of course, this is George R. Martin. He doesn't go too crazy with that stuff, but he likes to include it. So that's why we constantly come back to a little of both. Some of it's the reputation of proto-medieval women as rulers and the negative attitudes associated with them. Some of it is black magic and blood magic's kind of fun to include in a story if you keep it contained and not go too crazy with it. Maybe she went crazy with it, but story-wise, it doesn't have to go too crazy. So I feel like if we do learn more, and I think we will, they're only going to cement this reputation by lengthening the list of dirty deeds, dark doings, rather than it becoming somewhat balanced out by like, oh, actually, the Lostons weren't so bad. We find out some other takes from some different maesters, and maybe this balances. I really don't see that happening. I don't see that happening for the Boltons or Peakes either. But it just... It's better, maybe more interesting, more lurid, more lore about the darkness of Harrenhal would be fitting if it goes in that direction, and the supernatural, the dark, the evil, rather than trying to rehabilitate the image of that place. Why do that? It's more fun the way it is. Other than John Lothston in A Song of Ice and Fire, like I said, who in the Golden Company probably isn't actually a Lothston, our chance to see more of them likely falls in the Dunk and Egg books, and of course the Dunk and Egg show that's coming. The fall of Lady Danelle might even be what we see in Dunk and Egg if we see it. If we're going to have an adventure to Dunk and Egg that involves her, that might be it. Like, Maegor wants to come take her down, and maybe Dunk and Egg are involved in that. I mean, how can we not have a Harrenhal adventure in there somewhere? It's super. I mean, the Blackfyre Rebellion, she could be involved in the third Blackfyre Rebellion too. There's chances for her to be involved many times, actually. So it doesn't have to be just a one-time thing. I would also not be surprised to see them in Ashford Meadow in season 1 of the show. Not just to introduce them. I'm not saying they'll have lines, that they'll be part of the plot. Just see that flag, see that banner in the distance. We're going to see a lot of banners. It's a tournament, right? And Dunk isn't great with banners. So from our POV versus the reader POV, which is his POV, we should see a lot more sigils and understand what they are, because it's cameras. It's a narrator view when you're seeing cameras. It's not Duncan's point of view like the book. We might actually see Lawson's involved in the plot line of Hedge Knight somehow. Nothing big, I wouldn't guess, but just to have them there, just to see them, these guys are going to matter, build them up, get people familiar with them. I could see that. They could do the helmet trick, that they do, where this is Lord Lothston, but he doesn't say a word and he's in a helmet. So they don't have to cast the person that they really have in mind for the long term, or they just have a temporary actor or actress that's just wearing the armor and not talking, but has all the sigils and heraldry and everything. Yeah, that could happen. And of course, if there's ever a Blackfyre era rebellion show, then they would definitely play a part there as well. They'd play a significant part, maybe a very significant part. So all in all, there's a lot here to work with and a lot of room to do it. The direction the franchise is heading seems to be a place that's going to include this house. And I look forward to learning more about them. And I look forward to whatever George gives us in the future regarding them as well, because I think there's going to be some stuff. The first hour of the night in Westeros is called what? That was our trivia question. And it is called, I think a lot of you probably got this one.
Yes.
The Hour of the Bat.
People did guess it.
Nice. I went a little easier this time. You can kind of figure that one out by context, but it's fun to refer to those. There's 12. We don't know all the hours of night, but we do know that one. Next time, we have an episode called Stormborn coming, which will be all about Daenerys' birth, Rhaella's flight to Dragonstone, and the events that were happening around then, meaning the fall of King's Landing, so the end of Robert's Rebellion, basically, what happened that night, why did she have that nickname, all that. But we also have a scripted episode coming out shortly on Nymeria's Conquest of Dorne. That will be available for patrons very soon, soonish. And for the rest of y'all, in a few weeks or so. But you can sign up to Patreon to get it sooner. We mentioned a few other episodes that you might want to check out that are relevant to this one. Certainly our Blackfyre series, Aegon the Unworthy, is the first part of that, so that's one place to start. We talked about other Harrenhal episodes at the beginning. Curses with Dr. Kavita Mudan Finn. Old God's Eye with Joe Magician. Dreams of Daemon with Quinn the GM. Some very fun guest episodes we did that involve Harrenhal and the surrounding territory, the region. But also, of course, our Dunk and Egg series. We just talked about Dunk and Egg a lot in this episode, and we've got a lot of episodes on them. We did each book of the Dunk and Egg series. We did a full read through and 4 episodes on each, I believe it was. So you can find those in our catalog and everything else that we've got. And we hope you enjoy the large back catalog that we have. Lots of fun things to be found in there. Lots of ways to stay immersed in Westeros. Once again, Magic Mind, get 45% off the Magic Mind bundle. That includes a subscription to the Sleep Elixir and their classic mental performance shot. That's magicmind.com, VIP Jan. VIP How Jan. Thanks to Nina for her excellent notes. Lots of great theories and ideas. And this is one, like I said, we're working with a lot less information, a lot of triangulating, a lot of reading between the lines. Nina's really good at that. And I think it shows in episodes like this. Thanks as well to everyone else involved in helping History of Westeros be what it is. That includes our music makers, Joey and Jesse, and Michael Klarfeld for his video intro, which we see often. And if you want to support Michael, claradox.de, that's Klaradox.de. You can get his maps there, download them, and then have them printed on your own. That's it for today, everybody. You know what to do. Valar, reread us.